At the back of a narrow cedar closet, Ruth kept a blue coat wrapped in a dry cleaning sleeve that had yellowed at the seams. The plastic made a faint whisper each time she moved it aside to reach the scarves on the hook behind it. The coat had not been worn in 19 years. One button was loose. The lining near the cuff had thinned, where a wrist used to bend and lift and sort through winter errands. Still, Ruth never considered giving it away. She was 78 now, living in a small house with a galley kitchen and a window over the sink that looked onto a square patch of yard. Her daughter, Elaine, stopped by every Thursday with groceries and a bag of mail that Ruth still preferred to open with a letter opener instead of a finger. On those afternoons, the house filled with the practical sounds of continued family life. The coat had belonged to an ordinary period of Ruth's life, which was one reason she kept it. It was the coat she wore when she took the bus to the accounting office, where she worked for nearly 3 decades. It was the coat she wore to the bakery on icy mornings, when her son, Martin, was still small enough to wait on the front step in mittens too large for his hands. It was the coat she wore to the hospital when Elaine had her first child, and to the school auditorium when Martin played a tree in a winter pageant and forgot to stop waving at the audience. None of these memories were grand enough to become family legend. They belonged to the middle shelf of life. Yet Ruth had begun to understand that the middle shelf was where most of life had actually been stored. That Thursday, Elaine stood at the closet with a stack of empty hangers over one arm. She had offered, gently, to help clear some space before spring. The hallway closet was crowded, and the house had begun to ask for lighter arrangements. Elaine worked carefully, pausing before each decision. She lifted a cardigan, folded a rain hat, set aside 2 pairs of shoes that had grown stiff with disuse. Ruth sat on the bed and watched, aware that every object carried some small trail behind it. When Elaine reached the blue coat, she turned with it in both hands and waited. Ruth did not take it right away. She looked at the shoulders, still shaped by the hanger, and at the small dark buttons that had once looked dignified to her because they did not try too hard. She remembered leaving work after the first heavy snow of a season and feeling the weight of the coat settle around her, solid and familiar, like a hand at the small of the back. She remembered walking home alone one late afternoon while the sky dimmed early and thinking, without any language for it, that life was difficult and good in nearly equal measure. People keep many things for reasons that are not visible from the outside. A cracked bowl, a small habit, a phrase once spoken by someone who mattered. The object is rarely the whole story. It is only the handle. The real weight is carried by the life that once gathered around it. Ruth touched the sleeve. The fabric felt cool and slightly rough under her fingertips. She could have explained the coat if pressed. She could have said it reminded her of the years when the children still needed rides and forms signed and soup made before dark. She could have said it belonged to her most competent self. But Ruth had lived long enough to know that explanations often made things sound smaller than they were. Elaine sat beside her on the bed. There was no push in her posture, only patience. Ruth noticed how much of love, by this age, appeared in restraint. The willingness to let another person arrive at a decision without being tugged toward it. At last, Ruth smiled. A small private smile that softened her face. The coat could stay one more year in the closet. Not because it was useful, not because it was valuable, because some parts of life do not fade in proportion to their practical worth. Some parts remain because they continue to steady the hand that touches them. Elaine nodded and hung it back where it had been. The plastic whispered once more, and the closet returned to its usual dim order. Later that evening, after the groceries had been put away and the quiet had settled back into the rooms, Ruth opened the closet again and looked at the blue coat under the weak overhead bulb. She did not feel trapped by the past. She felt accompanied by it. She closed the closet door gently and went to put water on for tea, carrying with her the calm knowledge that what is kept is not always what is needed. Often it is simply what still knows how to hold a life together in one small corner. Some people keep the object. Some keep the movement of the hand that once reached for it. Some keep a sentence, or a route through town, or the order of a room at dusk. The years do their own sorting, and still a few possessions, habits, and memories remain near the surface, as if they know they will be asked to hold more than themselves. On the far side of a basement workshop, Leon kept a red metal toolbox on the lowest shelf, its handle worn smooth by decades of lifting. Inside were screwdrivers arranged by size, a measuring tape, and a socket set missing 2 pieces. Leon had not needed the box for daily work in years. He was 73 and retired from the maintenance department of a school complex. His wife, Denise, sometimes suggested moving the box upstairs. Leon always said, perhaps next month. The box stayed where it had always been, beneath the workbench he built when the children still lived at home. Denise knew the basement was not merely storage to him. On Saturday mornings, their grandson, Caleb, came over for a few hours while his parents ran errands. Caleb was 9 and still young enough to believe that every drawer deserved opening and every screw deserved classification. He liked the basement because nothing there was decorative. Everything had weight and purpose. That morning, rain moved steadily against the small windows near the ceiling. Denise was upstairs making soup. Caleb sat on an overturned paint bucket while Leon opened the red toolbox on the bench. Leon had planned only to tighten a loose hinge on the basement door, but once the toolbox was open, he moved more slowly. Leon remembered where several came from. One left behind by his father after an afternoon spent fixing a porch rail. What Leon kept in that box was not just equipment, it was sequence. The long habit of meeting a problem by opening metal latches, laying out possible answers and trusting that one of them would fit. He had done that with dripping pipes, rattling lockers, jammed windows, and bicycles with loose chains. Repair had been more than skill. It had been a way of staying calm inside the day. Retirement had removed the daily emergencies, but not the shape of the response. Leon still walked through the house, noticing what shifted and what squeaked. Denise teased him gently for hearing problems before they announced themselves. He had built shelves, repaired porch steps, fixed bicycle brakes, and once spent an entire December week coaxing an old furnace through the cold snap so the family could postpone paying for a replacement until spring. The box had been beside him through all of it, not as symbol, as companion. Caleb asked to hold the measuring tape. Leon let him press the button and listen to the metal ribbon retract. The quick, silver sound seemed to delight him every time. Leon watched the boy's face and felt an easing he had not expected. Skills moved forward in quiet ways, through afternoons, through objects passed from one set of hands to another. After the hinge had been tightened and the screwdriver wiped clean on a rag, Leon began returning the tools to their places. Caleb wanted to know why they had to go back in the same order. Leon considered the question longer than the question required. Order, at his age, was no longer about neatness. It was about honoring the fact that these things had served. When Denise came down with bowls of soup balanced on a tray, she found the toolbox still open and the two of them leaning over it as though it contained a map. In a way, it did contain a map. Not to the future, to the years when a family depended on ordinary repairs to keep a week from going sideways. A loose hinge, a broken drawer pull, a lamp rewired before company arrived. Small salvations had filled entire decades. Leon closed the latches only after Caleb had placed the measuring tape back inside. The click sounded final and familiar. Rain kept tapping the basement windows. Upstairs, the house held the smell of broth and onion and bread warming in the oven. Later, after Caleb had gone home and Denise was rinsing soup bowls at the sink, Leon returned to the basement to switch off the light. He paused beside the workbench and rested a hand on the closed lid. The room smelled of wood, metal, and old dust. He understood then that the toolbox was one of the few possessions that still met him in the language of competence. It reminded him that usefulness does not vanish all at once. Sometimes it settles into the objects that taught a person how to proceed. People keep what helps them stand steady, and the keeping itself becomes part of the steadiness. Marlene kept her mother's recipe cards in a biscuit tin that once held sewing notions. It sat in the pantry above the flour, behind a jar of lentils and a stack of folded paper bags saved for no urgent reason. The cards inside were stained with oil and vanilla, and the faint brown ghosts of fingertips that had turned them over in a warm kitchen long before Marlene's own hair had gone silver. At 69, Marlene still cooked most Sundays, even when nobody required feeding in the old way. Her husband, Victor, would read at the table with his glasses low on his nose and get up every so often to slice bread or wash a mixing bowl before she asked. Their daughter, Nina, came when she could, usually with her son Gabriel, who was 12 and ate with the serious appetite of a person who had not yet learned to pretend he was not hungry. Marlene still tied on the apron and began at the same hour. The habit had outlived its original purpose. When the children were young, Sunday cooking had been a form of preparation. Soup for Monday, rice for lunches. Something baked because the house felt steadier when the smell of onions and butter moved through it before noon. Later, after the children moved away, the habit became quieter. It was no longer about economy or planning. It was about shape. The week felt less loose when Sunday had first been given a task that belonged to the family. That morning, she lifted the biscuit tin from the pantry shelf and carried it to the counter. Gabriel stood beside her on a step stool, tall enough now that he barely needed it, though he still used it out of old custom. He liked opening the tin. He liked the dry whisper of cards against one another and the tiny bit of suspense before a recipe was chosen. Marlene flipped past dumplings, raisin loaf, baked fish, tomato sauce thickened with breadcrumbs, and a pudding that no one in the family truly liked, except her late aunt, who had insisted it was elegant. She paused at a card for chicken stew with parsley dumplings. The writing was her mother's, slanted and compact. That small difference in handwriting now looked like collaboration between two versions of a life. Gabriel asked why she never copied the recipes into a cleaner notebook. The card was hard to read in places. One corner had nearly torn away. Marlene rinsed celery under the tap and considered the question. A neat version would have been easier. It would also have removed the marks that mattered. The smudge near the dumpling measurements came from the year Nina was learning to roll dough and used too much flour. The little ring left by a wet glass had happened in the first apartment Marlene and Victor shared when the kitchen table was also the desk, the ironing board, and the place bills were stacked. A clean page could preserve the instructions. It could not preserve the life that had gathered around them. Victor came in from the yard with rosemary clipped from the pot kept by the back steps. He shook rainwater from his sleeves and laid the sprigs on the counter. Marlene noticed that he still set things down in the same careful way he always had, as though an object placed properly might save time later. That, too, was something people kept. Not merely what they owned, but the manner of handling it. By noon, the stew was thick on the stove. Gabriel had been given the job of tearing parsley leaves from the stems and took it as seriously as if the meal depended on him alone. Nina arrived carrying a loaf cake wrapped in a towel to keep it warm. The kitchen filled, not with noise exactly, but with the layered sounds of people who know their places in one another's day. A drawer opening, a spoon tapping the rim of a bowl, chairs being shifted closer to the table. When Marlene finally slid the recipe card back into the biscuit tin, she understood again that what survived in a family is often what has been repeated without announcement. A dish made often enough becomes more than dinner. It becomes timing. It becomes memory stored in the wrist and shoulder and nose. It becomes an ordinary inheritance that does not require explaining while it is still being lived. After the meal, Gabriel dried the card with a corner of his dish towel where a drop of broth had landed. Marlene watched him do it and felt a quiet gratitude. The cards would one day look even softer at the edges. Perhaps someone else would stand at another counter and read the same slanted measurements under another lamp. The handwriting would remain. The habit might remain as well. And if it did, it would not be because anyone had been instructed to keep it. It would remain because it had once fed more than hunger. Every Saturday before lunch, Bernard polished his shoes. He did not polish them because they needed it. He had been retired for 7 years. Most days he wore soft walking shoes with thick soles. Still, on Saturdays, after the newspaper had been folded and the breakfast dishes dried, he carried 2 pairs of leather shoes to the kitchen table and laid out the old brush, the tin of polish, and a square of flannel kept for no other purpose. His wife, Noreen, used the time to water the plants by the front window. They had moved into a smaller apartment after deciding the stairs at the old house were no longer worth the trouble. Some habits had crossed the move with them as surely as furniture. The polishing kit lived in the top drawer of the hall cabinet, besides spare batteries and a stack of folded shopping bags. The brush still held a dark shine in its bristles from years of use. The tin had worn lettering at the lid. Bernard's father had taught him to polish shoes at 14 as one of the quiet competencies a household expected. Bernard had kept the practice through college, through his first office job, through the years of commuting in all weather, through weddings, funerals, parent meetings, and holiday dinners. Some of those events no longer happened with the same frequency. The shoes remained. The act remained. It took 15 minutes at most, but it changed the shape of the morning. Noreen sometimes watched him from the sink while she rinsed a vase or trimmed stems from flowers left over from the market. She had once told their daughter, Clara, that Bernard made old routines look less like stubbornness and more like gratitude. That Saturday, Clara came by with a bag of mandarins and her own daughter, Tessa, who was beginning to notice what adults repeated and what they let slide. Tessa was 16, at the age when many household rituals seemed faintly mysterious or faintly unnecessary. She stood near the table and watched Bernard rub polish into the leather in small circles. Bernard kept the shoes not because they were rare, but because they had accompanied a life built from showing up. He had worn the brown pair to Clara's school recital when she forgot half the notes and kept going anyway. He had worn them to job reviews, to anniversary dinners, to the first meeting with the agent who helped them downsize after the children had settled elsewhere. The shoes had crossed ordinary thresholds. Enough ordinary thresholds become a history. Tessa asked if anyone even noticed polished shoes anymore. Bernard smiled and continued brushing. Perhaps fewer people noticed. That had become part of the comfort. The act no longer belonged to appearance alone. It belonged to continuity. There was peace in doing something with care that did not need to be witnessed to matter. When he finished, he set the shoes near the door where the afternoon light could fall on them. Noreen brought tea to the table. Clara peeled a mandarin for Tessa and left the curls of rind on a saucer. The apartment smelled of citrus and polish and the damp leaves of recently watered plants. Bernard looked at the shoes and understood, as he had in other quiet moments, that habits are among the most personal things people keep. They take up little room. They survive moves and losses and changing fashions. They ask almost nothing in return except repetition. Yet inside repetition, there is recognition. A way of saying that the self formed years ago has not entirely drifted off. Later, when the four of them walked to the bakery around the corner, Berna wore the brown pair. Tessa noticed, though she did not say so. On the way back, she shortened her stride to match his without making it obvious. Bernard noticed that too. People keep more than objects. They keep ways of attending to one another. Often those are the things that last longest. That evening, after the plates had been washed and the apartment had settled into its gentler hour, Bernard returned the brush and flannel to the hall drawer. The Polish tin clicked shut with a sound so familiar it almost disappeared. Small rituals often live at the edge of hearing. Their importance shows itself only when they are absent. For Bernard, the shoes were less a possession than a recurring pause, a brief weekly proof that care need not be urgent to be real. Some things are kept because they continue to serve. Some are kept because they continue to steady the hand that serves them. On the highest shelf of a linen closet, Judith kept a white ceramic bowl with a thin gold line around the rim and a crack running from one side down toward the base, like a fine river on a map. The bowl had been glued twice. It could no longer hold soup without risk, and Judith never trusted it with fruit because the weight seemed to widen the old damage. Even so, she wrapped it in a dish towel each time she moved a house, and every spring she took it down, dusted it, and returned it to the same shelf. Keys had gone into the bowl, change from Alan's pockets, hair clips, notes from school. During those years, Judith rarely looked at it closely. It was simply where the small, loose pieces of life gathered when there was no time to decide on a better place. Now she was 76, and the house was quieter than it had once seemed possible for a house to become. Not empty. Her son Daniel visited on Wednesdays after work, and her daughter Claire came every other weekend with a tote bag full of library books and whatever bread she had baked that week. Alan still lived there too, moving more slowly than he once had, but keeping his same habit of reading the back of every cereal box, as if new information might appear between meals. The life was still active, only more spacious. One rainy afternoon, Judith climbed the step stool to change the towels on the closet shelf and saw the bowl wrapped in the faded striped towel that had long ago been assigned to protect delicate things. She brought it down and carried it to the dining table where the better afternoon light reached. The crack was more visible than she remembered. The gold rim had worn away in 2 places. The bowl looked exactly like what it was, something ordinary that had stayed. Claire arrived not long after, shook rain from her umbrella, and found the bowl on the table beside a stack of clean bath towels. She ran a finger just above the crack without touching it. Judith could tell Claire remembered it instantly. Certain household objects enter a family so deeply that they do not need introduction. Judith remembered the night it first broke. Daniel was 10. Claire was 7. Alan had come home late with mud on his cuffs from a storm that turned the parking lot at work into a shallow lake. Someone bumped the counter. The bowl slid, fell, and struck the floor with a sound so clean it silenced the room for a moment. Judith had felt absurdly upset, not because the bowl was expensive, but because its breaking seemed to expose the strain everyone was already feeling. Alan crouched and gathered the pieces. Claire cried because children often cry on behalf of objects that adults tell themselves do not matter. Judith later glued the bowl back together at the kitchen table after the house was asleep. She never meant for the repair to become permanent. It simply did. By the time Daniel came over that evening, the bowl was still on the dining table, the crack lit by a lamp from the side. Daniel laughed softly when he saw it and remembered how the family had kept using it for keys after the repair, even though everyone knew it was weaker than before. No one announced that decision. The bowl simply resumed its place, a little changed and still familiar. That was what Judith had really kept all these years. Not ceramic, not a bowl with a faded rim. She had kept the proof that a home is often built from things that continue after small damage. Not perfectly, not invisibly, just sufficiently. She wrapped the bowl in fresh tissue paper while Claire folded the towels and Daniel put water on for tea. Alan, from the living room, asked whether anyone had seen the remote that had been beside him moments earlier. Claire found it under a magazine. Daniel sliced a lemon for the tea without being asked. The house moved around the bowl with the same old mixture of competence and mild confusion it had always known. Judith put the bowl back on the highest shelf before bedtime. She did not feel sentimental exactly. She felt confirmed. Families are not held together only by major events and declared loyalties. They are held by repeated handling, by the same dish towel used for delicate things, by the same bowl-catching keys near the door, by the same hands willing to glue what could easily have been thrown away. In the dark, after the closets were shut and the kitchen counters cleared, Judith thought of the bowl resting above the folded sheets. She liked that it remained in the house even without a job. Some objects earn the right to stay after usefulness ends. They remain because they have witnessed enough ordinary life to become part of the structure of memory itself. Every evening at 4:30, Samuel wound the mantel clock. It was walnut, darkened with age, with a brass pendulum visible through a small oval window and a face marked by hairline cracks around the numerals. Even so, he wound it at the same hour with the same key, turning until resistance met his fingers and no further. He was 75 and had inherited the clock from his older sister Irene when she moved into a smaller apartment where wall shelves were preferred to mantels and nothing that ticked loudly survived the cut. Samuel took the clock partly out of affection for Irene and partly because he had always liked objects that asked for a small steady duty. The clock required no expertise, only return. His wife, Paula, understood this. She left stacks of blank note cards in the drawer each December and replenished the bottle of ink when it ran low. She said the house sounded more settled when Armand was writing. The remark was accurate. There was a small scratch to the nib on paper, a pause while he considered the next line, then another brief run of sound. Writing by hand gave the afternoon a measured shape. One Tuesday in early March, rain sat low against the windows and turned the yard beyond them into blurred grey shapes. Paula was upstairs folding laundry. Louise had just removed her coat and placed the biscuit tin on the coffee table. Samuel stood before the clock and inserted the key. The gesture was so practiced it might have seemed empty to someone watching from outside. Yet Samuel felt, each time, the small pleasure of resistance in the spring and the faint click between turns. He remembered his father, winding a different clock in a different house, always before supper, always while the radio murmured farm reports from the corner. Samuel remembered being too young to reach the keyhole, and then, later, old enough to be trusted with the task one winter, when his father's wrist was wrapped in a bandage after a fall on ice. In that first turning, there had been a quiet seriousness, the sense that one was helping time keep its shape in the house. Samuel did not believe objects held magic. He did believe they held rhythm, and rhythm, over many years, could feel almost as powerful. After the clock was wound, Louise asked if it had ever fully stopped. Samuel considered and realized it had twice. Once during a move when the box marked fragile stayed unopened for 6 days in a hall. Once during the summer, Paula was in the hospital for tests, and the house lost its timetable because Samuel's attention had gone elsewhere. He remembered coming home late that week, hearing no ticking and feeling the silence of the front room as something larger than silence. The clock resumed afterward. So did Paula. But Samuel had not forgotten how quickly a household could lose the small motions that made it feel inhabited. At tea, Louise spread marmalade on a biscuit while Paula came down with the folded laundry balanced high in her arms. Rain kept sliding down the glass. The mantel clock ticked on, slightly loud for such a modest object, marking the room with patience rather than urgency. What Samuel kept by winding it was not simply an heirloom. He kept an interval, a part of the day that asked him to stop whatever else he was doing and place his hand on something old enough to remember other rooms. He kept the link between care and repetition. He kept, too, the quiet fact that houses remain alive through small duties performed on time, not only through larger declarations of love. That night, after Louise had gone and the dishes were drying on a towel near the sink, Samuel passed the front room and listened. The ticking met him before he reached the doorway. He stood there a moment in the dim light. The clock was not accurate enough to govern a train station or a courtroom. It was accurate enough to hold its place in a home. By then, Samuel understood that many of the things people keep are really appointments with themselves. A key turned each evening. A plant watered every Sunday. A loaf baked at first frost. The object remains, but what is truly preserved is the return, the willingness to come back, again and again, to the same modest act and call it part of a life. In the bottom drawer of a maple sideboard, Teresa kept a bundle of greeting cards tied with blue ribbon. The cards inside had remained, gathering the years without much space at all there. Teresa was 70. She lived with her husband, Omar, in a townhouse with narrow stairs and a dining room they used more often now than when the children still lived at home. In those years, meals were hurried, plates balanced around schedules, and cards often landed on the sideboard only briefly before being moved to make room for serving bowls. Once the children left and the calendar loosened, Teresa noticed she had started saving the cards instead of recycling them. Not all of them. Only the ones with handwriting that seemed to catch more than the occasion itself. One Sunday afternoon, Marina came over with her 6-year-old daughter, Poppy, to help Teresa choose dishes for an upcoming family meal. The cupboards had become crowded with plates from different decades, some inherited, some bought for specific gatherings that had come and gone. While Marina examined serving platters in the dining room, Poppy wandered to the sideboard and asked what was in the bottom drawer. Teresa opened it and showed her the bundle. To a child, saved cards can seem like a puzzling category of object. They are neither useful nor decorative. Their lives appear to have ended already. Poppy asked if Teresa was keeping them for the pictures. Teresa smiled and untied the ribbon. They sat on the rug and spread the cards in a loose fan. A card from Evan after his first year living away, with a note about learning to cook rice properly at last. A Mother's Day card from Marina, written the spring before Poppy was born, the handwriting slightly uneven, because Marina had mailed it from a doctor's waiting room and confessed as much in the margin. A small, folded card from Omar tucked into flowers on a year when money was tight and celebration had to be modest. The note inside mentioned a storm, a broken wiper blade, and the comfort of arriving home to soup. Nothing grand, nothing polished. Yet Teresa had kept it because it managed, in a few plain lines, to describe a marriage more truly than an expensive gift might have. As Poppy looked through the cards, Marina paused in the doorway and watched. Teresa noticed the expression on her daughter's face. It held amusement, affection, and the mild surprise that comes when a parent's private habits reveal themselves all at once. Children grow up inside a household without always seeing what their parents quietly preserve. Teresa herself had inherited the saving instinct from her father, though in him it took the form of rubber-banded letters in a desk drawer. He saved postcards, receipts from trips, folded notes tucked into lunch pails, anything that proved a day had been shared with someone else. Teresa used to think the habit sentimental. Age had altered the meaning. She now saw it as a form of evidence, not evidence for outsiders, evidence for the inward life. Proof that affection had taken material form and passed through the house. When Omar came in carrying 2 grocery bags, he found 3 generations seated on the rug, with cards spread around them like fallen leaves. He set the bags down, loosened his coat, and stood for a moment smiling in that restrained way of his that never demanded attention. Poppy held up one anniversary card and asked if he had written it. Omar looked mildly embarrassed and admitted that he had. What Teresa kept in the ribboned bundle was not paper alone. She kept the handwriting of people as it changed across years. She kept the phrasing particular to each one. She kept the ordinary occasions on which love had paused long enough to leave a mark. After the cards were stacked again and the ribbon retied, Teresa placed the bundle back in the drawer. The wood slid shut with a soft, dry sound. The sideboard looked unchanged, yet the room felt fuller to her. Not because the past had returned, but because it had never quite left. It lived in the drawers, in the cupboards, in the recipes and serving bowls and names on envelopes. Later, while she and Marina compared plates for the meal, Teresa thought about how little of a family's real history ends up in albums or formal records. More often, it lives in small saved things. Handwriting, stains on recipe cards, the wear at the arm of a favorite chair. What people keep is often what lets them feel, even briefly, the old texture of being known. Armand kept 3 fountain pens in a shallow drawer beside the kitchen phone, though the kitchen phone itself now sat unused, except during storms when the power flickered, and he liked knowing there was still one dependable line in the house. The pens lay on a folded handkerchief, as if they had earned a softer resting place than the drawer required. One pen had a cracked cap. One was heavier than the others and stained faintly at the grip, where blue-black ink had darkened the grooves. The third had belonged to his mother and wrote more dryly than Armand preferred, but he kept it filled anyway. At 77, Armand still wrote notes by hand for things most people now typed and sent in seconds. Grocery lists, birthday reminders, addresses copied from the backs of envelopes, thank you notes after meals. Small updates to his younger brother, Luke, who lived 2 towns away and answered almost everything with a postcard. Armand could use a computer well enough. His granddaughter showed him the basics twice, and he was not confused by them. He simply trusted ink more than screens to slow the mind to its proper pace. His wife, Celeste, understood this. She left stacks of blank note cards in the drawer each December and replenished the bottle of ink when it ran low. She said the house sounded more settled when Armand was writing. The remark was accurate. There was a small scratch to the nib on paper, a pause while he considered the next line, then another brief run of sound. Writing by hand gave the afternoon a measured shape. One Monday, Luke came over with a paper bag of pears from a roadside stand. The brothers sat at the kitchen table where light fell from a side window onto the old linoleum and made the pens gleam slightly each time the drawer stood open. Luke had brought a property tax notice that confused him. Numbers had been entered online somewhere, and mailed forms no longer matched the amounts. Armand read the pages, set them in order, and then opened the drawer. He did not reach for a pen merely to solve the notice. He reached because he trusted a written copy. He wrote the figures onto ruled paper, one beneath the other, and the confusion thinned. Luke watched with the patience of a man who had long accepted his brother's methods. Between them, there had always been this difference. Luke was faster to speak and quicker to improvise. Armand preferred sequence. Yet it was not only temperament the pens preserved. They preserved a memory of the years when words arrived more deliberately in the house. Holiday cards written after supper. Notes tucked into lunch pails. Addresses copied into an old book with a cloth spine. Celeste used to leave messages for the children beside the toaster. Nothing profound. Dentist at 3. Soup in pot. Back by 6. Even those small lines had carried tone in a way printed text never did. When their daughter Elise visited with her teenage son, Rowan, she sometimes asked Armand to address birthday envelopes because everyone in the family said his handwriting looked trustworthy. Rowan found that amusing and slightly mysterious. Trustworthy was not a word he associated with handwriting. Armand did not argue the point. He only uncapped a pen and let the nib settle into the page, each stroke steady, each letter distinct. That afternoon, after Luke had gone home with the copied figures tucked into his jacket pocket, Armand sat a while longer at the table. Celeste was in the next room, mending a hem. The radio played softly from the counter. He wrote 2 thank you notes that had been waiting a few days too long. The first was to Elise for bringing over soup during a cold week. The second was to a neighbor who had returned a casserole dish with shortbread inside. Neither note said much. Both felt worth sending. People keep many things because of what those things once did for a household. A pen that made a ledger legible. A knife that cut Sunday bread. A chair pulled close to the window each winter afternoon. But often the deeper reason is tempo. Some possessions remain because they defend a certain speed of living against disappearance. When Armand wiped the nib and returned the pen to the handkerchief, he noticed the late light gathering at the edges of the room. Evening had its own handwriting in that house. Shadows lengthening over the counter. The teacups set out before the water boiled. Celeste folding her mending with the thread still trailing from the needle. The pens would likely outlast him. That was not why he kept them. He kept them because they still persuaded his hand to move at the pace of thought. And because a life written too quickly can become difficult even for the writer to read. Leila kept an apron on a hook behind the pantry door, though she had half a dozen newer ones folded in a drawer below the oven. The one on the hook was faded blue with détour, 2 deep front pockets, and a hem repaired by hand in thread, a shade lighter than the cloth. The fabric had softened to the point where it almost draped like a towel. A grease mark remained near the left pocket from a long-ago splatter that no soaking ever removed. Leila chose that apron nearly every afternoon at 4. She was 72 and had come, almost without deciding it, to organize her later years around a daily hour of preparation. Not formal dinners, not elaborate baking, just the quiet ritual of making something ready before anyone arrived. Some days it was sliced apples with cinnamon. Some days, small sandwiches or soup reheated and brightened with lemon, or biscuits made from memory while the light tilted gold across the counter. Her husband, Frank, called the hour the house's turning point. Before it, the rooms felt scattered. After it, they felt gathered. Their son, Peter, lived nearby and stopped in twice a week after work. Their neighbor, Colleen, often appeared at the back steps around that same time under one pretext or another, sometimes with a library book to return, sometimes with mint from her yard, sometimes with no pretext at all. On Thursdays, Peter's daughter, June, came after school and did homework at the kitchen table, while Lila moved between stove and sink. The apron belonged to all those arrivals. It signaled that the day was shifting from separate errands into shared evening. Lila had not planned this habit. In younger years, the hour before supper was mostly strain. Children underfoot, laundry not yet folded, something spilling, a phone ringing at the wrong moment. She wore the blue apron because it was sturdy and because its pockets could hold clothespins, notes, and a wooden spoon. The apron was never sentimental then. It was equipment. Only later, when the house became quieter, did she notice how often calm had been built in that hour despite the pressure. Food cut and arranged, cups set out, butter softened. Small hungers met before they sharpened anyone's mood. The work had been practical. It had also been relational in ways she had not paused to name. One cold Thursday, June arrived with wet shoes and a backpack that seemed heavier than the child carrying it. She dropped into her usual chair with the relief of someone returning to a known harbor. Lila tied on the apron and began peeling apples. Frank, in the den, lowered the volume on the radio so June could read in peace. Colleen knocked once and came in with a jar of marmalade she had made from winter oranges. The house arranged itself around these movements as naturally as breath. June asked why Lila always used the old apron when the drawer held prettier ones. Lila looked down at the faded cloth and realized the answer was larger than she wanted to make it sound. The old apron had shaped itself to the work. The pockets sat where her hands expected them. The neck loop no longer tugged. The faint grease mark and lighter thread at the hem had become part of its face. New aprons still felt like guests. This one felt like a co-worker. As she cored the apples, Lila remembered tying the same apron behind her back while Peter and his sister stood on chairs to stir cake batter. She remembered wiping flour from a crying child's cheek with the clean edge of it. She remembered Frank, younger and leaner then, slipping in through the back door and taking a biscuit from the tray before supper. The apron held no magic. It held repetition, and repetition had worn the family into it. By the time Peter arrived, the apples were in a dish with cinnamon and brown sugar. The kettle was beginning to whisper, and June had completed 2 pages of math with exaggerated seriousness. Frank came in to set out plates. Colleen stayed for tea. No one had planned a gathering. The gathering formed because the hour had been prepared for it. What Lila kept on the hook was not cloth alone. She kept readiness. She kept the old instinct to make room at the table before hunger or loneliness had to announce themselves. In younger years, that instinct had felt like duty. In older years, it felt more like craft. After everyone left and the dishwasher hummed low in the dark kitchen, Lila hung the apron back on its hook. She smoothed the front with both hands without thinking. Many of the things people keep have been shaped by use until they fit not only the body, but the life around the body. They remain close because they still know how to begin an evening. From the hall, the apron looked plain and faintly worn. Lila liked that. The truest household things rarely call attention to themselves. They simply wait where they have always waited, ready to help turn another day toward home. Nora kept birthdays in a small black address book whose elastic strap had long ago snapped off. The book was no larger than her palm. Inside, the pages were crowded with names in several inks, some crossed through once and written again in the margins when people moved, married, or began using a different phone number. Nora had owned newer calendars. Still, the Black Book remained the one place she trusted. At 74, Nora lived alone in a second-floor apartment above a florist's shop. Her friend Miriam stopped in for tea most Wednesdays after volunteering at the hospital gift shop. Nora's life was not crowded, but it was threaded. The address book rested on a tray by the telephone beside a pair of reading glasses and a ceramic dish for coins. Every morning after breakfast, Nora opened it to the page for the month and ran a finger down the names. She did not do this out of fear that she would forget. She did it because remembrance felt different when it passed through the hand. Looking was a form of care. In earlier years, she had kept the book for practical reasons. There were many people to remember then. School friends of the children, cousins, neighbors, her husband's co-workers and their spouses. Nora had been good at keeping the fabric whole. She mailed cards early, tucked cash into some, a newspaper clipping into others, and wrote brief notes in a hand that slanted upward with optimism no matter the weather. After the children grew and her husband died, the list changed. Some names fell away by the quiet arithmetic of time. Others moved to new pages as grandchildren arrived. Neighbors became close. And Miriam appeared in her life after a water aerobics class neither of them truly enjoyed. The address book did not remain full in the same way. It remained alive. One April morning, Miriam arrived carrying tulips from the shop downstairs, their stems wrapped in damp paper. Nora had the address book open already and was writing a reminder to call her great-nephew Oliver after school, because 11-year-olds, in her experience, still answered phones if the call came before dinner. Miriam laughed softly at the sight of the little black book and admitted she had once kept a similar one, but had given up when too many people moved online. Nora understood the convenience of that. What she doubted was the feeling. The book did more than store dates. It gave shape to attention. The names looked different grouped under months, as if the year itself were a long hallway of doors that had to be opened one at a time. That afternoon, she and Miriam filled out 2 birthday cards at the table, one for an old neighbor now living near the coast who sent Nora a photograph of the sea every January without fail. Miriam borrowed Nora's better pen. Tulips opened wider in the vase as the room warmed. The scene felt modest and complete. Nora thought of her own mother, who had remembered birthdays without writing them down, and whose memory seemed, in childhood, close to supernatural. Age had taught Nora a kinder interpretation. Her mother remembered because she returned to people inwardly, again and again. The book was simply Nora's outward method of doing the same. By evening, the cards stood ready by the door, stamps attached, addresses checked twice. Nora closed the book and held it a moment longer than necessary. Its pages carried traces of a social life, measured not by crowds, but by continuity. A call made on time. A card arriving before the day had passed. A child somewhere feeling noticed. An old friend opening an envelope and seeing that she had not drifted beyond the edge of thought. What Nora kept in the black book was not data. She kept a practice of turning memory into action while action was still possible. Many memories live softly in the mind and disappear by nightfall. The ones written down ask for a hand, a stamp, a voice on the line. They become part of the outward structure of affection. Before bed, Nora returned the address book to the tray by the phone and set her glasses neatly beside it. Downstairs, the florist was closing. She heard the metal grate rattle into place and then the street settle. The little book looked unimportant in the lamplight. Nora liked that too. The strongest forms of keeping are often nearly invisible. A name remembered at breakfast. A card mailed before rain starts. A habit so modest no one thinks to praise it, though whole relationships may rest upon it. On the middle shelf of a bookcase in her front room, Adeline kept a stack of cloth napkins folded into exact rectangles and tied with a narrow cream ribbon. The napkins were plain white linen with a stitched border and 3 tiny initials worked into one corner in blue thread. Time had softened them. A faint tea-colored shadow remained on one from a spill decades earlier. Another had a small mend near the hem where a ring once caught and pulled a loose strand. Adeline washed them by hand twice a year and returned them to the shelf even though she seldom laid a formal table now. She was 79 and lived in a brick duplex with a modest dining room that had become, over the years, more memory than necessity. Her son Graham came on Sundays with a newspaper and a loaf from the bakery near his apartment. Her daughter Celia visited on Wednesdays after finishing work at the library. There were still meals at the table, soup in cool weather, tomato slices in summer, roast chicken for birthdays. Yet the full tablecloth and linen napkins appeared only a few times a year now. And even then, the gathering was smaller than it had once been. The napkins had belonged to her mother before they belonged to her. Adeline kept them because they had taught her something about the way ordinary care could alter a room. In her childhood, the napkins came out for Sunday dinners, for an uncle visiting from another county, for no reason more elaborate than a pot roast cooked especially well. Their presence changed the meal without making it stiff. Bread was still passed by hand. A child still spilled milk. Someone still forgot the serving spoon and had to fetch it. But the cloth on the lap and the heavier weight of the fork seemed to gather the family into better posture, not only of the body, but of attention. When Graham was young, he used to tuck one napkin into his collar before Adeline could stop him. Celia, more careful, folded hers neatly after supper and placed it beside her plate, as if the meal had been part of a lesson she meant to pass. The children were older now. Graham had gone grey at the temples, yet Adeline could still see the earlier versions of them each time she untied the ribbon and spread the napkins across the table to air. One Thursday in late spring, Celia arrived with a carton of strawberries and an intention to help sort cabinets before summer. They worked through drawers and shelves with the calm efficiency that grows when 2 people know each other's pace. A chipped pitcher was set aside. 3 extra ladles were discovered. At the back of the dining room cabinet, Celia found the folded napkins. She lifted the ribbon and asked no question aloud. Adeline saw the look on her daughter's face and understood it. Why keep these when paper would do? Why keep them ready when the large gatherings had thinned? Adeline took one napkin and opened it fully on the table. The linen held the faint smell of the cedar drawer seat where it had been stored. What she had kept all these years was not fabric alone. She had kept a standard of welcome that never depended on wealth. The napkins represented the old family belief that people were worth preparing for, even when the meal was simple. A peeled carrot arranged on a plate, water poured before anyone asked, a cloth napkin unfolded on the lap instead of a paper square taken from a dispenser. Small things, repeated for decades, become atmosphere. That evening, Adeline laid the table for the 2 of them with the napkins and the good salad bowl. Celia sliced the strawberries and spooned them over plain cake. The room looked almost the same as it had on countless other evenings, except that the white linen at each place setting gave the meal a faint brightness that paper never would have carried. Nothing in the conversation was ceremonious. They discussed the neighbor's new dog, the state of the pantry, the rain expected by Monday. Yet the table felt steadier for being set with care. Later, after Celia left and the dishes stood drying on a towel by the sink, Adeline ironed the napkins lightly and folded them back into neat rectangles. She tied the ribbon with the same small knot her mother used to make. By then, she knew that many of the things people keep are really instructions with the words removed. A napkin can say the evening matters. A polished spoon can say someone was expected. The object stays because the meaning still serves. She returned the bundle to the shelf and switched off the dining room light. In the dimness, the ribboned stack looked almost too modest to carry so much history. Adeline liked that. The deepest household wisdom often hides inside plain things that only seem decorative until another meal begins and everyone sits a little straighter around the table. In the top drawer beside the stove, Perry kept a pocket knife wrapped in a handkerchief. The knife had a bone handle yellowed with age and a blade that no longer snapped open with youthful confidence. It opened slowly now, with a small resistance near the hinge, as if the metal preferred not to be hurried. Perry sharpened it twice a year with a stone he kept in the garage and wiped the blade with a little oil before folding it shut. Plenty of newer knives lived in the kitchen. This one almost never left the drawer. Perry was 81 and lived with his wife, Mavis, in a ranch house with low windows and a back door that opened into a narrow strip of garden. Their son, Neil, came by most Saturdays to look at whatever on the property had begun leaning, dripping, or rattling. Their granddaughter, Taryn, arrived more often because she liked the kitchen table, the bowl of peppermints, and the way Mavis always had something cooling under a clean towel. Perry moved more carefully than he once did, but his hands still retained the old economy of a person who had spent a lifetime mending, trimming, opening, and adjusting. The pocket knife had belonged to Perry's uncle, then to Perry, and had never become an heirloom in the polished sense. It was simply present through the years. It opened seed sacks and cut twine from parcels. It trimmed frayed edges from rug pads. It sharpened carpenter pencils and opened bags of birdseed on the porch. When Neil was a boy, he watched Perry use it with the respect children often reserve for tools that seem both ordinary and forbidden. The knife marked a category of adulthood that had little to do with age and much to do with steadiness. Mavis understood why Perry kept it, though she teased him for wrapping it as if it were made of crystal. She had seen him rely on that knife in 100 small situations that no one later remembered. A broken thread on a hem before church. A peach split open for a child too impatient to wait for proper slicing. A cardboard box opened during a move, while everyone else searched for scissors. Useful objects often disappear into the background precisely because they do their work without ceremony. One autumn afternoon, Taryn came over to help Mavis shell beans at the table. Rain tapped softly at the windows. Perry stood at the counter, cutting the string from a brown paper parcel that Neil had left earlier. He used the pocket knife, then wiped it and began wrapping it again in the handkerchief. Taryn asked why he used that one when there were easier knives close by. The question was practical, not skeptical. He kept the knife because it had taught his hand a certain pace. Newer tools were sharper, lighter, simpler to clean. They did not carry the same measure. This blade made him slow slightly, pay attention to the pressure of the cut, and finish the motion cleanly. It had accompanied the years when a household relied on repair more than replacement. Buttons were sewn back, hinges were tightened, string was saved. Wrapping paper was folded and used again if it had not torn. The knife belonged to that ethic without ever needing to explain it. After the beans were shelled, Perry took Taryn to the mudroom and showed her how he sharpened the blade, not by spectacle, but by angle and patience. The stone made a soft scratching sound Taryn watched with serious concentration. Mavis, from the doorway, recognized the expression on the child's face. It was the look of someone realizing that care can hide inside a repetitive act. Not everything of value arrives with novelty. Some value lives in maintenance. By supper time, the parcel had been broken down for recycling. The beans were simmering on the stove, and Neil had returned to fetch the jacket he left draped over a chair. He found the knife back in its drawer, wrapped and resting as if no one had touched it. That too was part of the habit. Useful things were returned properly so they would be ready for the next small need. A house, Perry had long believed, was not kept whole by grand efforts. It was kept whole by dozens of small returns. Later, after Taryn had gone home and the kitchen had been wiped down for the night, Perry opened the drawer once more and touched the folded handkerchief. He knew it was only metal and bone and a hinge worn smooth by years. But some possessions continue because they preserve a way of meeting the day. In that drawer lay an old lesson about readiness, thrift, and measured hands. He turned off the light above the sink and went down the hallway where Mavis was already settling into her chair with a magazine. In the dark kitchen, the wrapped knife remained invisible. Perry liked that too. The things people keep longest are often not the showiest or the rarest. They are the ones that still know how to assist a life without demanding attention for it. In the drawer of a narrow hall table, Merritt kept a stack of folded paper maps held together with a rubber band that had been replaced so many times it no longer seemed part of the original bundle. The maps showed counties, highways, side roads that had been widened or rerouted since the paper first left the printing press. Some had circles penciled around exit numbers. Some had coffee stains in the corners. One had torn along a crease and been repaired with clear tape that had turned amber with age. Merritt had not depended on them for navigation in years. He kept them anyway. He was 76 and lived with his partner, Joanne, in a townhouse with a small front garden and a spare bedroom used mostly for storing holiday boxes and half-finished projects. Their niece Sadie visited every other weekend and often stayed for supper. Merritt liked to drive her home afterward by the slower roads. Sadie was old enough to use a phone for everything and young enough to find Merritt's attachment to paper both amusing and respectable. For most of his working life, Merritt had driven as part of the day. He belonged to that broad class of adults who spent years going where needed to be gone. Job sites, parents' houses, school auditoriums, grocery stores after dark, a hardware store 2 towns over because it carried the only hinge size that fit. The maps lived first in the glove box, then under a seat, then in the hall drawer after phone screens took over the task of getting people from one place to another. Joanne remembered those years well. She remembered Merritt spreading a map over the hood of the car during summer trips, tracing a finger along a blue line while the children from the next campsite rode bicycles past. She remembered him marking a road to avoid because of construction, then finding a small diner by accident and deciding that accidental diners were often the best kind. The maps had taught them a style of travel that included margin and detour. There was room to get turned around without feeling lost. One warm Saturday, Sadie came by with a carton of iced tea and an intent to help Joanne sort the hall closet. Coats were rehung. A broken umbrella was discarded. An old flashlight was tested and found still serviceable. When Sadie opened the hall drawer and saw the bundle of maps, she laughed softly and asked whether any of them could still be trusted. Merritt took the top map and opened it over the dining table. The paper gave that dry, crackling sound old maps make, halfway between stiffness and surrender. He trusted them less for instruction than for perspective. A paper map did not speak. It did not recalculate with brisk patience. It simply showed the larger field. Roads together, rivers crossing under them. Small towns set at measured distances instead of appearing one by one through a windshield. Merritt liked that form of seeing. It reminded him that travel was not only about arriving efficiently, it was also about understanding where one was in relation to everything else. Sadie studied the penciled circles and asked what they meant. Merritt remembered nearly all of them. One marked the turn toward Joanne's sister's house, when their nephews were still small enough to race down the front steps at the sound of the car. Another marked a route used for years to visit his mother on Sunday afternoons. Another circled a roadside orchard where Joanne insisted peaches were always worth the stop. The maps had not just carried roads, they had carried repeated human intentions. Visit, help, return, wander a little longer before going home. By late afternoon, the closet had been straightened and the iced tea sweated on coasters in the front room. Merritt refolded the map with the care of someone handling a garment rather than a guide. Sadie watched him do it and seemed to understand that some old possessions remain not because they outperform newer ones, but because they preserve a way of moving through the world. There had once been more patience in travel, more room for noticing barns, weather, and the shape of towns passed through only once. That evening, Merritt drove Sadie home by the longer road as usual. Joanne sat beside him and pointed out a stand of trees just beginning to turn. Neither of them needed a map for the route. Still, when he returned, Merritt placed the bundle back in the hall drawer with a kind of relief, as if restoring not paper, but proportion. Many things people keep are really old forms of attention. A paper map asks for unfolding, pausing, and reading the whole before choosing the part. It asks a person to accept distance instead of pretending it has vanished. Merritt liked that. Distance had always been part of living. So had the pleasure of knowing the way well enough to take the scenic road and arrive a little later, but more accompanied by the trip itself. On the shelf above the washing machine, Lucinda kept a marble-covered notebook with the corners gone soft and the spine reinforced by a strip of cloth tape. The pages inside held brief entries in pencil. First frost on the rail, daffodils up by the fence, tomatoes started indoors, too much rain for beans, last hummingbird gone. The notes ran across 18 years of seasons and rarely took more than a line or two each. To anyone else, the notebook might have looked like a ledger of weather. To Lucinda, it was closer to a household companion. She was 74 and lived in a white frame house with a deep backyard and a clothesline that still got regular use except in the worst winter weeks. Her younger brother Ellis stopped by on Tuesdays with practical offers to trim shrubs or carry heavier things. Her grandson, Micah, often came on Saturday mornings to help in the garden and eat whatever sweet roll Lucinda had made before dawn. The house moved at an unhurried pace. There was almost always some exchange in progress. Seeds, soup containers, jam jars, returned with clean lids. Lucinda had begun the notebook during a spring when everything in her life seemed to be happening too quickly. Ellis was changing jobs. Micah was newly in school and speaking in long, excited bursts about buses, pencils, and recess politics. The garden that year had gone wild with rain, then shrunk back under a hot, dry spell. One evening, after losing track of when she had planted the peas and when the lilacs first opened, Lucinda wrote the date in an old composition book and made a note about the smell of damp soil. The act steadied her. She repeated it the next week, and then the next season, and then without deciding it, for years. The entries were not literary. They did not need to be. Lucinda wrote the way a person leaves a pin in a map. Enough to mark the place. Enough to say this happened, and it happened here. Over time, the notebook became proof that seasons were never as repetitive as they first appeared. One year, the marigolds held deep into October. Another year, the peas failed twice. One spring brought robins earlier than expected. Another spring delayed the tulips until the neighbors had already begun talking about summer. Micah liked flipping through the notebook because it made the yard seem to have a memory beyond what he could see at one glance. He would sit at the utility room table while Lucinda transferred laundry from washer to basket and asked about entries from before he was born. Lucinda remembered nearly all of them. Not just the frost or the rain, but what else was happening nearby. Ellis patching the gate latch. A pie cooling on the sill. A cat from 2 houses down sleeping under the hydrangeas as though it paid rent. One April morning, Micah arrived with muddy shoes and an armful of seed packets chosen more for their pictures than their suitability. Lucinda laughed, set the kettle on, and opened the notebook to the page marked for the new year. They stood at the back door looking at the garden bed still dark from last night's rain. Micah asked whether the notebook was for remembering or for planning. It was for both, though neither purpose entirely explained it. The notebook helped her remember what the land had done before and plan what might be sensible next. More than that, it kept her in a relationship with the passing year. A season goes by whether anyone notices it or not. Writing it down turned attention into participation. The notes made change less abstract. They showed that time was not only something lost, it was also something observed while it moved. By noon, they had planted the carrots, straightened 2 leaning stakes, and carried a basket of damp towels outside for the line. Ellis arrived with a bag of potting soil and stayed for soup. While they ate, Micah read an old notebook entry aloud about the year. A late freeze blackened the early roses. The room warmed with recognition. Even records can gather people. A line in pencil opens back into a shared afternoon. When Ellis left, Lucinda returned the notebook to the shelf above the washing machine where it belonged among workaday things. That placement always pleased her. The deepest records of a life were not always kept in albums or polished boxes. Sometimes they lived beside detergent and clothespins, close to the chores from which the notes had first emerged. Later, as the first load dried on the line and the garden darkened toward evening, Lucinda thought again about the old notebook. Many of the things people keep are not valuable because they preserve grand moments. They matter because they teach a person to notice continuity, bud to blossom, heat to coolness. Child to older child. A pencil line on a page can hold a surprising amount of patience. Over the years, Lucinda had come to trust that patience almost as much as the weather itself. On the windowsill above the kitchen sink, Jonas kept a small radio with a cracked ivory knob and a strip of tape across the battery cover. The radio was hardly larger than a paperback and had once been blue, though years of sun had washed it toward grey. It picked up only a handful of stations clearly, and one of those drifted in and out depending on weather. Even so, Jonas turned it on every morning while the kettle heated and every evening while he dried the supper plates. The house owned newer devices that could deliver any song requested. Jonas kept the little radio because it still knew how to arrive in the room without being commanded. He was 73 and lived with his husband, Colin, in a bungalow with low eaves and a front porch crowded by potted herbs. Their friend Maura from next door often stepped through the side gate around dusk with a zucchini, a newspaper clipping, or some small bit of neighborhood news that did not need urgency, but benefited from sharing. Colin handled most of the cooking. Jonas handled breakfast, dish towels, and the habit of keeping the day gently accompanied by sound. The radio had entered the house almost by accident. Colin bought it many years earlier for use in the garage when they were repainting old chairs found at a second-hand shop. The chairs were sold eventually, then the garage was reorganized, then the radio moved to the kitchen and never really left. Over time, it became attached to simple tasks: slicing pears, wiping counters, waiting for soup to reach the point where steam begins to turn fragrant. Its value came less from what it played than from where it lived in the rhythm of the room. Jonas liked the modesty of radio. A station chose the next song without consulting anyone. A weather report drifted through. A calm voice announced the hour. There was companionship in that sequence. It reminded him of earlier kitchens, where sound entered from outside the self and gave shape to chores. In his childhood, his mother ironed with a radio on the shelf above the mending basket. Later, in his first apartment, Jonas kept a radio on the refrigerator because silence made the rooms feel unfinished. The little device by the sink linked those kitchens together. One rainy Wednesday, Maura came over while Jonas was rinsing lettuce and Colin was kneading dough at the table. The radio was playing a piano piece almost lost under the tap water. Maura asked, with the half-amused tone of someone who had known them for years, why they still used that old thing when Colin could set up something sharper and cleaner in 5 minutes. Colin smiled, but left the answer to Jonas, who turned down the water and looked toward the windowsill. He kept it because it placed the day in a wider current. A radio signal came from elsewhere and met the kitchen as it was. It did not ask what mood the room was in. It did not sort itself around preference. It simply arrived and became part of the air for a while. Jonas had grown to value that. Too many things in later life became tailored, filtered, arranged exactly to taste. The radio preserved a little room for surprise and for acceptance. One listened to what came, and the morning moved forward. After lunch, Maura stayed to help Colin portion dough into pans, while Jonas wiped jars and set them back on the pantry shelf. The radio moved from music to a gardening report, then to a local choir recording that wavered slightly at the edges. None of it was important in the official sense, yet the house felt more complete for having sound that no one had personally selected. It was like weather through an open window, not always perfect. Still welcome. Toward evening, when the bread had cooled and Maura had gone home with a loaf wrapped in a towel, Jonas stood at the sink drying plates while Colin stacked leftovers. The radio played softly beside the dish soap. The kitchen lamp had been turned on. Rain still pressed against the glass. Jonas realized that the little radio had become one of the household's quiet witnesses. It had been present through repairs, dinners, hurried breakfasts, and slower years after work schedules loosened. Objects that stay long enough often stop being possessions and become part of a room's temperament. Before bed, Jonas clicked the radio off and the kitchen grew suddenly larger in the silence. That brief change always reminded him why he kept it. Many things people hold on to do not improve life by adding something dramatic. They improve it by preventing the room from becoming too bare. A little signal from elsewhere, a voice marking the hour, music entering while dishes are dried. Sometimes what is kept is simply whatever has learned how to accompany a life without crowding it. Each evening just before sunset, Darius swept the front steps with a corn broom whose straw had worn to a rounded fan. The broom leaned beside the porch door, its handle smooth where his hand closed around the same place, night after night. There were newer brooms in the utility closet with plastic bristles still half attached. Darius used those indoors. The corn broom remained for the porch, the walk, and the small square of concrete by the mailbox where leaves and dust gathered by late afternoon no matter the season. Darius was 78 and lived alone in the house where he and his sister had grown up, though alone was not quite the right word for the shape of his days. His niece Briar lived 3 streets over and came by often with containers to return and questions about plants, bills, or stuck window latches. Mr. Klein waved most evenings from his driveway while bringing in the bins. Children from the end of the block cut across the sidewalk with backpacks and quick conversation before supper. The house no longer held a full family, but it remained stitched into the movement around it. He had started sweeping the steps years earlier, when his father's knees grew unreliable. At first, it was one more household duty folded into others. Shake the mat. Sweep the steps. Wipe the rail if pollen was thick. Bring in the post. Later, after his father recovered some strength, Darius kept doing it because the brooming marked the close of the day in a useful way. It took 5 minutes. It also made the evening feel claimed rather than merely arrived at. Briar used to laugh at how exact he was with the corners. He swept not only the broad surfaces but the shallow groove beside the top step where grit liked to settle. He swept the edges of the walk where grass clippings clung after mowing. He swept after rain if the storm had left petals or seed husks behind. The act looked almost ceremonial, though Darius would have rejected that word. To him it was maintenance, no more and no less. One mild September evening, Briar arrived with a sack of late apples from a co-worker's tree and found Darius halfway through the steps. Golden light had lowered across the porches on the street. The broom made a soft brushing sound, then a pause, then another brushing sound. Briar stood beside the rail and watched him finish, noticing, as she always did, that the sweeping changed his posture. His shoulders lowered. His attention narrowed to what was directly before him. It was one of the few tasks he never rushed. When she asked why he kept that old broom instead of using the newer push broom from the closet, Darius rested the handle against the railing and looked down the tidy walk. The old broom worked better, but that was only part of the answer. It moved lightly enough to clear dust without sounding harsh against the concrete. It asked the right amount of effort. More than that, it belonged to the hour. Some tools earn a place not because they are superior in every context, but because they fit a specific ritual exactly. The porch had gathered many evenings under that broom. Summer dust, wet leaves in October, salt tracked home in winter, petals from the tree near the curb each spring. Darius remembered sweeping while his mother watched from inside, with a dish towel over her shoulder. He remembered Briar as a girl, using the broom upside down like a horse's head until he took it back and showed her the proper grip. The broom had outlasted its original purpose and settled into something quieter. It now cleared less debris than before, but it still cleared the mind that used it. After the steps were done, Darius and Briar sat on the porch with the apples between them in a bowl. Mr. Klein lifted a hand. A dog barked once. The street was ordinary and complete. Darius realized, as he often did at that hour, that sweeping was not really about cleanliness. The steps would gather leaves again by morning. Dust would return. The work mattered because it created a short transition between obligation and rest. A person does a modest task, and then the evening can begin. When Briar left, Darius leaned the broom back in its place beside the door. Its straw looked thinner each year. He knew one day he would have to replace it, though he postponed the thought in the same way people postpone replacing habits that have become part of the body. What is kept is not always meant to last forever. Sometimes it lasts long enough to teach a rhythm, and then the rhythm survives even if the object does not. Still, for now, the broom remained. In the fading light, it looked almost incidental, just one more household thing by a back door. Darius preferred it that way. Much of what steadies a life remains plain in appearance. A swept step, a cleared mat, a short evening gesture that tells the house, and the person inside it, that the day has been seen to. folded at the foot of the guest bed. Sonia kept a grey wool blanket with a satin binding worn thin at the corners. The blanket was heavier than any of the newer ones in the linen closet and not nearly as soft. It smelled faintly of cedar most of the year because Sonia stored it with sachets in a trunk during the warm months. When the weather cooled, she brought it out, shook it once in the yard, and laid it across the spare bed as if expecting company. Soon, whether company had actually announced itself or not, Sonia was 71 and lived with her wife, Helene, in a Cape house whose upstairs room sloped under the roof. Their nephew, Kellen, often stayed over when the storms made the drive home to his town unpleasant. Their friend Ria from the choir dropped in for tea and occasionally slept in the guest room after late winter rehearsals. The room was not occupied often, but Sonia kept it ready in the old-fashioned sense. Fresh towels in a basket, water glass on the table, an extra pair of reading glasses in the drawer. The blanket belonged to that idea of readiness. It had first belonged to Sonia's father, who kept it in the car for emergencies and picnics, and then later, when his driving years ended, folded over the back of his chair through the cold months. Sonia inherited it not through ceremony, but through habit. After helping clear his house, she realized she had taken the blanket almost without thinking, along with a pie plate and a flashlight and a tin of loose screws. The other things scattered into ordinary use. The blanket became one of the few objects that still carried the gravity of his practical kindness. Her father was a man who believed comfort should be prepared before it was requested. A thermos filled before a drive. An umbrella by the door before rain fully arrived. An extra sandwich wrapped for the person who turned up unexpectedly and tried to refuse food on grounds of politeness. The blanket held that same instinct. It was warm, durable, and slightly plain. It did not try to decorate a room. It tried to be available when the temperature dropped. One November evening, Kellen arrived later than expected after a school meeting ran long. Wind rattled the shrub branches against the porch rail. Helene reheated soup while Sonia went upstairs to pull back the guest bed. She spread the grey blanket over the folded quilt and smoothed the corners with both palms. The gesture was automatic by now, but it carried an old satisfaction. A room changed character when it was readied for someone else. It stopped being spare and became welcoming. Kellen noticed the blanket the next morning because it was warmer than the sleek synthetic throw he used at home. Over breakfast, he asked why Sonia still kept such a heavy one when lighter blankets were easier to wash and easier to store. Sonia looked toward the stairs, where the guest room held the quiet shape of a slept-in bed, and thought about the answer while slicing oranges. She kept it because some objects preserve a philosophy of care more clearly than any speech could. The blanket did not merely warm the body. It implied that discomfort should be anticipated, not waited for. It belonged to an era of households that prepared for cold, delay, and unplanned guests with steady matter-of-factness. Sonia had come to see that such habits were not old-fashioned burdens. They were forms of respect. Later that week, Ria stayed over after rain turned to sleet and made the roads shine under the street lamps. Sonia again laid out the blanket, this time with a hot water bottle under the sheet because Ria always felt chilled after singing in drafty halls. Helene watched from the doorway and smiled in that quiet way long partners do when they have seen a routine repeated enough times to know it has become part of a person's character. By the end of winter, the satin binding showed one more loose thread, and Sonia sat by the front window to mend it before putting the blanket away for summer. She worked slowly, not trying to make the repair invisible, only strong. Helene read nearby. The afternoon light thinned across the rug. Sonia understood that what she had really kept was not her father's blanket, but his stance toward guests and weather, an ordinary human vulnerability. Keep the room ready. Keep warmth nearby. Do not wait for someone to say they are cold. When the blanket went back into the cedar-lined trunk, Sonia did not think of it as being stored. It was resting between uses. Many of the things people keep are not sentimental in the obvious sense. They remain because they continue to embody a useful tenderness. Wool, cedar, a mended corner, a bed prepared in advance. The materials are simple. The message beneath them is simple too. A person was expected. A person can rest here. That is often enough to make a house feel held together. In the drawer of the end table beside the sofa, Felicia kept a deck of cards secured, a paper band gone loose at one edge. The cards had softened at the corners and bowed slightly from years of shuffling. One queen was marked with a faint crescent of T, and the ace of clubs bore a thin line where it had once been bent and pressed flat again under a dictionary. Felicia owned other decks, cleaner and easier to read light, but this was the one she reached for whenever anyone stayed after supper long enough for the evening to open out. Felicia was 77 and lived in an apartment on the third floor of a building with a broad lobby and a stubborn elevator. Her brother Adrian came over every Friday with pastries wrapped in paper. Her daughter Noelle dropped by midweek, often with her son Jasper, who had become old enough to understand rules, yet still young enough to misplace strategy in favor of enthusiasm. The apartment was small, but the sofa and two armchairs formed an easy circle around the table. It was a room arranged for sitting a while. The deck had entered the family during years when entertainment was not purchased often, and evenings tended to be made rather than consumed. Cards after dishes. Cards during storms. Cards on holidays while pies cooled, and no one wanted another cup of coffee yet. Felicia learned early that a deck could change the temperature of a room. It gave restless hands a task. It turned silence companionable. It let several generations occupy the same hour without requiring deep conversation or elaborate planning. Adrian had always been the loud shuffler, the kind of player who treated every hand as if the future of a nation depended on it. Though even in defeat, he remained more amused than wounded. Noelle, as a girl up to, preferred sorting the suits by color before any game began. Jasper now liked the fan of cards in his hands and the brief suspense before anything was laid on the table. Felicia loved all of it because it created repeated evenings that became difficult to tell apart in the best possible way. One snowy Saturday, after stew and bread had left everyone pleasantly slow, Jasper asked whether they could play before going home. Felicia opened the end table drawer and took out the old deck. The paper band slipped free. Adrian was already clearing teacups from the table. Noelle folded a throw blanket and set it aside. The room shifted almost invisibly from meal to game. Felicia noticed, as she often did, how many family rituals survive because they are easy to begin. Jasper asked why she always used the old deck when the newer deck from the holiday drawer had larger numbers and no bent cards. Felicia fanned the worn cards across the table and paused before answering. The older deck shuffled better in her hands, which was true. But more than that, it held the marks of evenings already lived. The tea stain, the softened edges, the slight bowing in the stack all testified to hours passed around tables like this one. The deck had become less an object than a container for repetition. They played until the snow thickened against the window and the tea water had to be heated again. Jasper lost twice, nearly won once, and learned how to hide disappointment behind concentration. Adrian accused the deck of favoritism in the same comic tone he had used for decades. Noelle laughed with her head tipped back the way Felicia remembered from her teenage years. Around the cards, everyone began partly themselves as they were now, and partly themselves as they had been before. That was one of the quieter powers of repetition. It lets time layer instead of simply pass. After the last hand, Felicia gathered the cards and squared the deck against the table with a neat tapping motion. She slid the paper band back around it and returned it to the drawer. The movement took only a second, but it pleased her every time. A ritual closed properly stays available for the next occasion. Later, after Adrian had gone, and Noel was bundling Jasper into his scarf and hat by the door, Felicia looked around the room at the teacups, the plate of crumbs, and the slight disorder left by a spent evening. She thought about the deck in its drawer and understood again that many of the things people keep are simple devices for making shared time recur. Cards are only paper and ink. Yet for years they had drawn chairs closer, slowed departures, and given generations a common table. Once the apartment was quiet, Felicia switched off the lamp by the sofa and let the room settle into blue winter light from the window. In the drawer, the deck rested among coasters, spare batteries, and a pencil sharpened at both ends. It did not need display. The strongest household objects rarely do. They remain close because they know how to turn an ordinary evening into something that can be repeated and therefore remembered. By the door of the shed, Calder kept a green thermos with a dent near the base and a cup that screwed onto the top with a faint squeak. The paint had chipped away in two narrow lines where years of use had rubbed it against the edge of a bench. Calder rinsed it each evening and filled it again each morning with black tea before carrying it into the yard. The thermos was old enough that his daughter Mara claimed it had become part of the property line. Calder only smiled and set it on the same hook beside the door. He was 75 and lived in a narrow house with a deep lot that widened unexpectedly at the back into a patchwork of beds, paths, and fruit trees. Mara and her son Finn came over on Sundays, sometimes to help weed, sometimes only to wander the rows and leave with more herbs than they knew what to do with. The yard had been many things over the years. A place for swing sets, then a place for vegetables, then a place for slower work that no longer answered to necessity, but still answered to devotion. The thermos had crossed all those phases without comment. Calder first bought it during a period when he worked outdoors in all weather and wanted hot tea by mid-morning without having to return to the house. It proved reliable through frost, drizzle, and long afternoons of fence repair. Later, even after his working life changed and the urgency lessened, he kept carrying the thermos outside. It became part of the yard's grammar. Pruners, gloves, twine, thermos. Some objects earn permanence through plain consistency. On spring mornings he set the cup on an overturned crate and drank while looking over what had changed overnight. A branch bent lower than expected. Lettuce lifting. Tulips nearly open. On hot afternoons he poured tea into the cup and let it cool while he sat on the bench beneath the pear tree. The drink itself mattered less than the pause it created. Tea in the yard prevented the work from becoming a blur. It turned effort into interval. Finn noticed this before he had language for it. As a small child, he called the thermos the garden bottle and insisted that serious planting could not begin until Calder had set it in its place. Now at 12, Finn still looked for it when he came through the gate. One Sunday, he arrived early and found the hook empty. Calder was at the sink filling the thermos while Mara washed strawberries. The boy stood there, waiting for the cap to tighten, as if the morning were not fully assembled without that final twist. Mara sometimes asked why Calder had not replaced it with a lighter one or an insulated mug that could go in a car cup holder and into a dishwasher without complaint. Calder knew the newer options were easier. He also knew that ease was not always the measure that mattered. The thermos has held enough for several cups. It kept tea hot for hours. It stood upright in the dirt without tipping. More than that, it belonged to a practice of staying put long enough to deserve a pause in the middle of the work. That Sunday, the three of them spent the morning thinning carrots and tying up peas. Finn found worms and treated each one like a discovery. Mara pruned mint with decisive little cuts that reminded Calder of his own mother trimming cloth for quilts. Around 11, the thermos came down from its hook, and the three of them sat on the bench. Calder poured tea for himself and warm water for Finn from a separate jar. Mara took the cup on her lap just to warm her hands. For a few minutes, nobody worked. The garden continued without assistance. Bees moved where they were already going. Calder had come to understand that many of the things people keep are really anchors for pace. The thermos did not only carry tea, it carried permission to stop without calling the stop an interruption. In younger years, pauses can feel like delays. Later, they begin to look more like part of the work itself. Plants are noticed during pauses. Children ask questions during pauses. The body gives its honest report during pauses too. When the cups were emptied, Calder screwed the lid back on and returned the thermos to the hook by the shed. The dent near the base caught a brief line of sunlight. Finn ran ahead to inspect the strawberries again. Mara followed with a basket on her arm. Calder stood a moment longer and looked at the green thermos as if it had just arrived there, though it had occupied that corner for years. It remained one of the yard's most ordinary items, and for that reason, one of the truest. A garden is made not only of soil and weather, but of repeated gestures that teach a person how to stay long enough to notice what is growing. Each night before going upstairs, Odessa left the lamp on in the front room for 1 extra hour. The lamp stood on a narrow table beneath the front window, its shade cream-colored and slightly darkened at the top from years of warmth. It was not a special lamp. The base was simple brass. The pull chain clicked. Yet Odessa kept to the habit with unusual faithfulness. Supper dishes would be done, the counters wiped, the chair cushions straightened. Still, before bed she crossed the room, clicked on the lamp, and let its light rest in the window, until the timer, she later added, clicked it off near midnight. Odessa was 72 and lived in a duplex with her cousin Lenora, whose sleep came earlier and more reliably than Odessa's ever had. Their son-in-law, Marcus, stopped by after late shifts to return containers or pick up leftovers on his way home. The young woman across the shared driveway sometimes came to borrow sugar or a screwdriver or simply to stand in the doorway for 5 minutes. No one needed the lamp. The porch light already worked. Yet the front room lamp remained part of the house's evening face. The habit began years earlier when Odessa's children were still living at home and coming in at uneven hours from jobs, classes, rehearsals, and long drives back from other towns. She found that a late front room changed the sound of a late arrival. Keys at the door felt less lonely. A person stepping in from rain or cold entered not just a dark house, but an already welcoming one. The lamp was a small declaration that the household had not fully withdrawn for the night. Someone might still be awake. Even if no one was awake, the house had kept a little attention in reserve. When the children moved out, Odessa thought the habit would disappear on its own. It did not. The lamp stayed on for Marcus when he dropped by late, for Lenora when choir practice ran long, for herself when she stepped out to bring in a forgotten scarf from the car. More than once, the young woman from next door crossed the drive and later admitted she had come over because the lamp made it look all right to knock. Odessa never made much of that admission, but she remembered it. One evening in early winter, Lenora had already gone up to bed, and Marcus was due only briefly to return a casserole dish. Odessa finished wiping the table and switched on the lamp. Outside, the cold had a stillness to it. The window reflected the room back into itself, while also showing the soft square of light cast onto the front curtains. Marcus arrived 10 minutes later, then lingered longer than expected because his day had been heavier than he first let on. They drank tea at the kitchen table while the lamp continued to burn in the front room, making the house seem inhabited all the way to the street. Marcus asked why Odessa bothered with that lamp every night. Odessa looked toward the doorway where the light from the front room met the darker hall. The answer, she realized, had become less about practical illumination and more about stance. Some habits survive because they continue to offer a household's old promise in a modest form. Warmth is here. Return is possible. Knock if needed. The lamp carried that promise without requiring language. Later, after Marcus left and the casserole dish was back on its shelf, Odessa sat a few minutes in the front room with her knitting untouched in her lap. The lamp made a circle on the rug and left the corners of the room pleasantly dim. She remembered winter nights from years before, hearing the back door or front door open and feeling her body register the relief of a safe return. It occurred to her that many family habits are built from repeated relief. A light left on, water warmed in a kettle, a blanket folded at the end of the bed. The gesture repeats because it once mattered, and then it keeps mattering because people continue to need somewhere to arrive to. By the time the timer clicked the lamp off, Odessa was upstairs brushing her hair. She always heard the little metallic sound through the floorboards and found it oddly reassuring. The house had completed its final task for the day. Downstairs, the front room darkened in stages, first at the window and then across the rug. Nothing dramatic changed, yet the habit had once again placed a reserve of welcome into the night. What people keep by this stage of life is often less about possession than about transmission. A lamp in the window says the same thing an old guest blanket says, or a deck of cards waiting in a drawer, or a thermos on a hook by the shed. Some objects remain because they continue to carry forward a way of receiving other people. Odessa liked that thought without needing to dwell on it. She turned down the bed covers, listened to Lenora turning a page in the next room, and let the house settle around its stored gestures of care. In the top cupboard above the refrigerator, Beatrice kept a tin of buttons sorted by familiarity. The largest ones lay in a shallow glass jar inside the tin. Coat buttons with heavier shanks went into one corner. Small shirt buttons collected in a paper envelope folded and refolded until the edges felt like cloth. Beatrice, at 76, treated it as a quiet part of the household's long memory. She lived with her husband, Owen, in a narrow house with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that still held the old breakfast table where bills, school papers, mending, and sliced peaches had all once taken turns occupying the same surface. Their daughter Nadine came by on Tuesdays after work and always noticed if something in the house had been repaired so neatly that the repair nearly disappeared. Their grandson, Eli, liked the button tin because it made a soft, bright sound when opened, like tiny pieces of weather collected in metal. Beatrice had started saving buttons for ordinary reasons. Shirts wore out before their buttons did. Coats lost a match and waited for replacement. Cardigans handed down through cousins needed one practical compromise after another. In the years when money had to stretch farther than pride preferred, nothing small and still usable was discarded without a look. Beatrice snipped buttons from garments before turning the cloth into rags. She tucked them away, not with ceremony, but because sooner or later a household would ask for them. It did ask. School uniform shirts, winter coats, pillow covers. Once, during a week of steady rain, she replaced every mismatched button on a house dress, while Owen read the paper aloud from the other room, and the children built card houses on the floor. Another year, she saved a favorite sweater of Nadine's by finding 2 blue buttons, so close in shade that only Beatrice ever knew they had not been there from the start. The tin became proof that small preparedness can preserve comfort in ways larger plans never notice. One late winter afternoon, Eli sat at the kitchen table while Beatrice shortened a hem for Nadine. The hem itself was simple. The button tin came out because one cuff button had cracked clean through. Eli watched Beatrice turn the pieces over in her palm, then open the tin and search with the quick, precise touch of someone who had long ago learned how to feel difference before seeing it clearly. Owen came in with oranges from the market and paused to watch the search. Eli asked why she kept so many when stores still sold whole cards of new buttons in neat rows. Beatrice held up a brown one to the cuff and then chose a different brown, softer and more correct. She kept them because these buttons had already proved themselves willing to remain. They had crossed years, washing cycles, weather and impatience. They belonged to garments that had served real lives. A new button could do the job. An old one carried a little more household experience in its face. She also kept them because the tin represented a kind of thinking that had nearly vanished from ordinary rooms. It assumed that breakage was part of living and that repair, in many cases, was simpler than replacement. Not cheaper in every moment, perhaps, and not always easier, but steadier. The same hand that hemmed a curtain or turned a collar could also keep a shirt from being given up too soon. Beatrice liked that scale of care. It was human-sized. When the new old button had been sewn in place and the cuff looked right, Eli asked to sort the tin by color. Beatrice let him, though she knew she would quietly restore the older logic later. Owen peeled an orange and set segments on a saucer between them. The kitchen filled with that mild domestic closeness that comes when several people are occupied by the same small task. Nothing in the room was urgent. Even the mending seemed less like correction than continuation. By evening, the tin was back in the cupboard. Beatrice wiped the table free of thread clippings and returned the needle to its case. She thought, as she often did after using the tin, that many things people keep are not impressive on their own. Buttons are very nearly nothing when separated from the cloth they once fastened. Yet they remain because they know something about staying attached. They wait in darkness for the next loose cuff, the next slipped cardigan, the next small unraveling that can still be answered by a patient hand. Later, when Owen turned down the bed and Nadine called to say she had reached home safely, Beatrice stood a moment in the kitchen and looked toward the cupboard where the tin rested above eye level. She liked that it was near the ceiling, out of the daily way and still available. Some household wisdom lives exactly there, not on display, not forgotten, simply kept in reserve, ready to make a modest repair when the fabric of an ordinary week asks for one. At the back of a hall closet, Conrad kept a wooden yardstick with faded black numbers and a paint smudge near the 30-inch mark. It leaned in the corner, behind umbrellas and a folding chair, too long for any drawer and too modest for display. New tape measures lived in the junk drawer and in the glove box of the car. Conrad used those often. The yardstick stayed because it had become the household's slower instrument, the one brought out when accuracy mattered, but haste did not. Conrad was 74 and lived with his sister Maureen in the bungalow where they had both returned after different decades elsewhere. The arrangement had begun as practical help and settled into companionship. Maureen baked on Sundays and claimed the better chair near the front window. Conrad fixed small things and still wrote grocery items in a pocket notebook. Their nephew Ross came by most weekends with his daughter Willa, who was 8 and still curious about tools that looked ceremonial. The yardstick had once belonged to Conrad's father, who used it for more than measuring lumber. It checked curtain hems, shelf spacing, mattress widths, and how much a child had grown between one autumn and the next. Conrad remembered standing against a kitchen wall while the stick rested lightly on his head, and his mother laughed at the seriousness of the procedure. In those years, Measurement felt less mathematical than relational. It connected the body, the room, and the passing of time. Later, when Conrad worked in a machine shop, measurements belonged to stricter settings. Metal tolerated no guesswork. Fractions mattered. Still, the old yardstick remained in the family house and later in Conrad's own apartment because it asked for a different tempo. It had no spring-loaded return, no clip, no flashing digital certainty. It had weight in the hand and required the eye to travel along its markings. It made a person look from end to end. One Saturday, Ross arrived with a narrow bookshelf that needed one extra shelf cut to fit a space in Willa's room. The wood would be trimmed elsewhere, but Conrad wanted the measurement taken properly at home first. He opened the hall closet and pulled out the yardstick. Willa followed him to the dining table with the bright patience children bring to adult tasks that include numbers and wood shavings. Maureen, at the counter, was pitting cherries for a pie and listening without appearing to listen. Willa asked why Conrad used the long old stick instead of the shiny tape measure on his belt. Conrad laid the yardstick along the shelf board and slid it carefully until the black numerals matched the edge. He kept it because it had taught him to read space without snapping forward or recoiling back. A tape measure could collect numbers quickly. The yardstick made dimension feel present in the room. It turned a measurement into something seen and held rather than merely announced. He also kept it because the stick had lived through too many ordinary household decisions to be reduced to a tool alone. It had measured tablecloth drops before company came, checked whether a couch would fit through a door, and once helped Ross build a cardboard theatre in the living room during a week of winter rain. Lengths of life attach themselves to objects that are used steadily enough. The object becomes a witness to planning, improvising, and making room. When the numbers had been written down and Ross left for the lumberyard, Willa asked if she could use the yardstick to measure the kitchen tiles. Conrad let her move slowly across the floor with it while Maureen rolled pie dough and pretended not to notice each solemn report from tile to tile. The room held that pleasant overlap of generations doing different kinds of exactness. Flower circles on the counter. Pencil marks in the notebook. A child learning that measuring is one way of paying attention. By late afternoon, the finished shelf was in place and Willa had arranged her books by height, just for the satisfaction of seeing them rise and fall. Conrad returned the yardstick to the hall closet and leaned it in the same corner as before. He understood, as he had in other years, that many things people keep are not valuable because they are rare. They matter because they preserve an older scale of contact with the world. Hand to wood, eye to mark, room to object, person to person after supper, when Maureen cut the cherry pie and Ross called to say, the shelf fit without adjustment. Conrad thought of the yardstick behind the umbrellas. He liked that it remained a little awkward to store. Some useful things resist being tucked neatly away because they belong to a lengthier way of moving through a day. They ask for open table space, steady light, and a willingness to measure not only what will fit on a shelf, but what still fits in the hand after many years of use. In the drawer of a narrow desk by the front window, Hollis kept a black composition book filled with room measurements, appliance model numbers, paint names, dates of repairs, and odd practical facts that might have seemed excessive to anyone who had not yet needed them. Ceiling fan bulbs, small base, window in back room, 52 1/4, hall paint, cloud grey, 2 coats. The cover had softened at the corners and bowed slightly where it had once been left in damp grass during a move. Hollis called it the house book and reached for it with the same confidence other people gave to online searches. He was 77 and lived with his partner, Celia, in a duplex, always receiving some modest improvement. A shelf added in the utility room. A leak watched carefully until it justified repair. A lamp rewired rather than discarded. Their son-in-law Peter came by on Thursdays to help with heavier jobs, and their neighbor Asher often borrowed tools. The house book sat in the desk drawer through all of it, waiting for the next detail worth retaining. Hollis began the book during the first month in their earlier home when too many small decisions arrived at once. Curtain lengths, paint samples, furnace filter sizes, whether the back door would clear a new rug. He realized quickly that houses generate their own forms of forgetfulness. A measurement taken in confidence vanishes by afternoon. Writing the details down gave the place a second memory, one that did not depend on guesswork. Over time, the entries thickened into a domestic record more complete than any photo album could have been. There were notes from the year Peter helped rebuild the front steps, notes about the deep shelf Hollis added when Asher's young twins kept knocking over the potted basil she had left within easy reach. The book did not preserve grand occasions. It preserved the particular problem-solving by which people gradually shape a dwelling to fit real bodies and repeated days. One rainy afternoon, Asher arrived with a small folding table she hoped to fit between a radiator and the wall in her apartment. She had measured once and wanted Hollis to confirm it because Hollis, in neighborhood terms, had become the keeper of dimensions. He smiled, opened the desk drawer, and brought out the black book. Peter was in the kitchen replacing a loose cabinet pull while Celia sorted seed packets at the table. Asher asked why Hollis still kept the book when photos of labels and notes on a phone could store the same information faster. Hollis turned to the page for radiator measurements and ran a finger under the line written 2 winters earlier. He kept the book because paper gathered things differently. A notebook let one practical fact sit beside another until a pattern appeared. Paint shades beside shelf depths, bulb sizes beside dates of storms. The details ceased to be isolated errands and became part of one shared effort to care for a place. He also kept it because the book had started recording not only the house, but the people around it. Peter's handwriting appeared on pages where he had measured lumber. Celia had once added a note about which curtain hooks worked best in the guest room. Asher had penciled in the dimensions of her own kitchen window and laughed at her neatness afterward. The entries were factual, yet they carried companionship in the margins. When the radiator measurement confirmed that the table would fit if turned sideways, Asher left, relieved, and Peter tightened the last screw in the kitchen. Hollis returned the book to its drawer, then brought it out again moments later to add one more line about the cabinet. Pull size Peter had used. By evening, the rain had cleared and the front window reflected the room back toward itself. Hollis thought of the black book in the desk drawer and understood that many things people keep are really protections against unnecessary starting over. A good note preserves effort. A measured doorway spares a future lift. A remembered paint name saves a wall from almost matching. Yet beyond convenience, the book offered something quieter. It proved that a life in one place is built from accumulated exactness. Later, after Peter had gone and Asher sent a note that the table fit as hoped, Hollis sat by the window while Celia read in the lamplight. He liked knowing the book was near at hand. Houses forget quickly unless someone remembers on their behalf. The black notebook had become that remembering. Not elegant, just steady. A stack of small retained facts that let the next task begin a little closer to completion than the last one did. In a ceramic jar on the pantry shelf, Agnes kept lengths of saved string wound into loose circles and tucked one behind another like pale nests. Some were red and white from bakery boxes. Some were plain cotton from parcels. One dark green length had once tied rosemary around a roast and still held the faintest memory of kitchen herbs if lifted close. Agnes did not keep every scrap of string that entered the house, only the sturdy pieces, the ones that could be untied without fraying into nonsense. Agnes was 73, and lived with her brother Julian in a weathered house with a long back porch and shelves built slightly crooked. Their niece Flora visited after school twice a week and liked to sit at the pantry doorway while Agnes cooked or packed leftovers into tins. She began saving string in the years when nearly everything seemed to need tying. Newspaper bundles, tomato stakes, parcels sent to cousins, stacks of letters, bread boxes that would not stay shut in the car. A good piece of string could hold several kinds of temporary order at once. Agnes learned early that a house accumulates small loose things faster than it accumulates solutions. String gave shape to what would otherwise spill, slide, or scatter. Julian appreciated the jar because he was forever bundling odd lengths of dowel, rolled maps, and garden canes. Flora appreciated it because Agnes let her choose which string to use when wrapping slices of cake for neighbors. The jar served not only the kitchen, but the whole idea of making a thing manageable for transport. A tied parcel is easier to carry. A tied stack is easier to trust. Even a box of old photographs feels more deliberate once a loop of cotton crosses the lid. One bright afternoon, Flora came in from the yard with an armful of seed packets that had scattered from a tote and now needed carrying back to her mother's car without losing half of them again. Agnes opened the pantry and lifted down the ceramic jar. Julian, at the table, was sanding a small birdhouse roof and leaving a fine crescent of dust near his elbow. Flora asked why Agnes saved string when rubber bands, tape, and plastic clips existed in nearly every drawer. Agnes laid 3 lengths on the table and chose the plain cotton one because it would tie flat and untie kindly. She kept string because it allowed temporary order without aggression. Tape tears paper. Clips snap. Rubber bands dry out and surrender at inconvenient hours. String can hold firmly and then let go with dignity. It suits the kind of household work that expects to be reopened later. She also kept it because tied things carried a certain visual honesty she had always liked. A loaf wrapped in wax paper and tied at the top looked cared for. A stack of letters bound with string looked worth returning to. Bundled herbs drying in the pantry seemed less like clutter and more like intention. The material was simple, but the gesture improved whatever passed through it. That was often true of small, old-fashioned habits. They did not merely solve a problem. They gave the solution a human face. By the time the seed packets were tied into a neat sheaf, Flora had asked to wrap 2 slices of spice cake for the widower at the end of the lane who never accepted a full tin because he claimed he would only forget to return it. Agnes cut paper from the roll, folded it around the cake, and let Flora tie the string herself. Julian watched from the table, smiling only with one corner of his mouth so the sanding would not quite stop. The package sat there afterward, looking modest and complete, like an answer prepared before anyone had to ask for it. Later, when the pantry had been closed and the cake delivered, Agnes returned the remaining lengths to the ceramic jar. She thought about how many things people keep are meant for uses that are partly practical and partly social. String fastens. It also presents. It says, "This is for carrying or keeping or giving away without fuss." The saved lengths on the shelf had become a quiet inventory of future usefulness, not grand enough to notice daily and too handy to live without once absent. That evening, Julian used a piece to tie kindling in a small bundle for the porch box, and Flora called to report that the spice cake arrived intact. Agnes smiled at the thought of the jar on the shelf. She liked its lack of ambition. It did not promise transformation. It only promised readiness for the next loose thing. In many homes, that is nearly the whole art of keeping, not preserving everything, only holding on to enough simple means that the scattered parts of a day can be gathered again without strain. Beside the back door, Miriam kept a narrow cane-bottomed chair with one rung repaired in darker wood and a blue cushion. The chair was not especially comfortable by modern standards. Its seat sat a little higher than most, and the back met the spine with more honesty than softness. Even so, Miriam never considered replacing it. The chair stood in the same patch of late afternoon light through most of the year, and seemed to belong there as naturally as the door itself. Miriam was 78 and lived with her sister Laurel in a farmhouse set among fields that no longer belonged to the family but still framed the house with familiar distances. Their neighbor Thomas stopped by most evenings on his walk home from the feed store. Their grandniece Ivy came on Sundays and preferred the porch swing, though she always ended up in the kitchen by supper time with one foot hooked around the cane chair's front rung. It began as an ordinary kitchen chair bought second-hand when money and furniture were both scarce. During the busiest years, it stood at the table with the others and received whatever work arrived. Peas shelled into bowls, socks sorted from laundry, notes written before school buses came. Miriam remembered standing over a child's arithmetic page while that chair sat pulled out and waiting. She remembered Laurel mending a sleeve in it with the screen door open and rain moving through the trees outside. It was one more place where life paused briefly before moving again. Only later, after the table had fewer daily occupants and the pace of the house changed, did the chair settle by the back door. From there, it became the place for removing muddy shoes, cooling pies, and resting a bag of groceries before carrying them farther in. Thomas often took it for 10 minutes at dusk while Laurel cut basil or Miriam snapped beans. Ivy climbed into it to watch cake batter being mixed, her elbows just reaching the table edge. The chair absorbed each roll without complaint. One August evening, Thomas came over with a paper sack of peaches from a roadside stand. Laurel was rinsing jars for jam. Ivy sat on the floor, drawing crooked barns with too many windows. Miriam pulled the cane chair a little closer to the doorway to catch a breeze and then set the peaches on its seat until the counter cleared. Thomas laughed that the chair still worked harder than most people he knew. Miriam smiled because the remark was nearly true. Ivy asked why they kept that chair when one leg had once cracked and been repaired in mismatched wood. Miriam rested her palm on the cane seat before answering. They kept it because it had learned the dimensions of their ordinary life. It held groceries, bodies, aprons, and baskets at exactly the right height. It waited in the proper place. A new chair could be more stylish, lighter, kinder to the back. It would not yet know the habits of the room. She also kept it because the chair had become one of the house's quiet agreements. Sit here while the pie cools. Sit here while the shoes come off. Sit here while telling the small news of the day before going home. Such agreements are rarely spoken. They gather around an object through repetition. After enough years, the object no longer seems interchangeable. It becomes a location in the emotional map of the home, as real as any room with walls. That evening, while Laurel stirred peaches and sugar in the preserving pan, Thomas took the chair for his usual 10 minutes, and Ivy leaned against its side with her drawings spread around her. Miriam stood at the sink cutting fruit and thought how much of domestic continuity rests on such arrangements. A repaired rung, a cushion changed with the season, a known place where someone can set down a burden, or themselves, before the next thing. When the jam jars had sealed and Thomas had gone home with 2 peaches left in the sack, Miriam returned the chair to its patch of light by the door. She did not think of it as furniture, exactly. It had become more like a recurring pause built of wood and cane. Many things people keep are really permissions. A chair by a back door says, rest for a minute. It says, set that down here. It says this house still expects the gentle traffic of ordinary arrivals and departures. Near bedtime, Ivy asleep upstairs under the eaves and Laurel turning off the kitchen lamp, Miriam glanced once more at the chair by the door. It looked plain, repaired, and completely right. She liked that appearance. The objects people keep longest often show their service openly. They do not hide the darker wood of repair or the shine left by years of use. They remain because they fit a life that has been lived in them, around them, and with their help more times than anyone can easily count. On the side of a small desk in the den, Esther kept a hand-crank pencil sharpener bolted in place with 2 flathead screws and a thin metal tray that slid out when shavings gathered too high. The paint on the sharpener had once been deep green. Years of hands had worn the edges down to a duller color near the crank and opening. Mechanical pencils filled a mug on the desk. Pens lived in every room. Even so, Esther still fed cedar pencils into the sharpener whenever a list, recipe note, or game score deserved graphite rather than ink. She was 75 and lived with her husband, Vernon, in a townhouse where the den had gradually become the room for tasks that required sitting down and finishing properly. Bills, crosswords, seed orders, holiday card addresses. Their daughter, Simone, often stopped by after work to use the copier and leave with a small stack of labeled folders under her arm. Their grandson, Theo, liked the den because it contained paper in useful forms and because the pencil sharpener made a satisfying sound that no screen could imitate. The sharpener had entered the house during the years when homework covered every flat surface by late afternoon. Esther mounted it beside the desk because pencils vanished, snapped, dulled, and needed reviving with a frequency that seemed almost malicious. Vernon used it for carpentry marks on scrapwood. Simone used it for arithmetic. Theo now used it to sharpen colored pencils for maps he drew of imaginary train routes. Across all those years, the crank turned and the spiral shavings gathered in the tray like curled evidence of attention. Esther liked pencils because they made revision feel natural. Grocery quantities changed. A date moved. A note about garden peas needed a different variety, written in smaller letters above the first. Pencil accepted the provisional nature of ordinary planning. Ink could feel too final for the way real days unfolded. The sharpener then did more than create a point. It refreshed a tool meant for adjustment. One grey morning, Simone came in with a stack of forms to fill out for a school event and sat at the den desk while Vernon repaired a picture frame in the next room. Theo sprawled on the rug with a notepad and a ruler. Esther opened the desk drawer, took out 3 cedar pencils, and turned the crank one by one. The den filled with the dry wooden fragrance that arrived each time the blade met fresh cedar. Theo looked up at once, as children often do when a familiar sound signals the beginning of serious but pleasant work. He asked why Esther bothered with that old machine when sharpened pencils could be bought by the box and a battery sharpener would be faster. Esther tipped the curled shavings into the wastebasket and smiled. She kept it because the old sharpener slowed the start by exactly the right amount. A person selected a pencil, turned the handle, tested the point, and only then began writing. That little sequence gathered attention. It told the hand that the work, however small, had actually begun. She also kept it because the sharpener had taken part in so many modest acts of thought. Spelling lists, budget notes, seating plans, measurements for curtains, names of people to remember with soup during a hard week. Objects become dear not only through sentiment, but through repeated proximity to concentration and care. This one had stood beside decades of human planning, revising and trying again. By midday, the forms were complete. Theo had drawn 3 stations and a tunnel, and Vernon had fitted the frame corner neatly back into place. Esther emptied the sharpener tray and noticed the small pile of fragrant curls in her hand. Shavings are nearly the opposite of what people keep. They are the part pared away, so the useful point can return. Yet even they had their brief beauty. She dropped them into the bin and wiped the metal tray clean. As afternoon light shifted across the den carpet, Esther thought about the sharpener on the side of the desk and understood that many things people keep are not ends in themselves. They are devices for readiness, a kettle for tea, a lamp for evening, a chair by the back door, a crank that restores a point to the pencil before words are asked of it. Such objects remain because they help transform intention into action without strain. That evening, Theo sharpened one last pencil before leaving, though it hardly needed sharpening. Vernon pretended not to notice, and Simone took the completed forms with quiet relief. After the door closed, Esther rested her fingers once on the cool metal housing of the sharpener. It stayed where it had always stayed, slightly old-fashioned and completely at home. She liked that faithfulness. The objects people keep longest often support the mind as much as the task. They provide a reliable beginning, and in many rooms that is more valuable than speed. Twice each autumn, Imogen took the quilts from the cedar chest and carried them to the porch rail to air in the thin sun. She did this on clear mornings only, after the dew had fully lifted and before the shadows turned cool again. The quilts were not museum pieces. One was pieced from feedsack cotton. One had a faded star pattern in blue and cream. The heaviest was stitched in broad, simple lines and had lost a bit of batting at one corner where the seam had been repaired twice. Imogen used them all in rotation through the winter. Airing them was less preservation than greeting. She was 79 and lived with her son David in a low brick house where the cedar chest stood at the foot of the guest bed. His daughter Kira came over many Saturdays and understood that quilt airing days meant the porch smelled of cedar, sun, and old cotton in a way she associated with the true beginning of colder weather. Imogen had learned the practice from her mother, though not in the form of an explicit lesson. She absorbed it by watching. Quilt to rail. Turn once before noon. Bring in before damp rises. Fold with the smoother side out. Such knowledge entered the body quietly. By the time Imogen had her own house, she was carrying quilts to the porch in the same order, without ever having announced to herself that she meant to continue. The quilts held years in their seams. One had covered David during a winter of childhood fevers mild enough to be more inconvenience than alarm. Another had lined a cradle when Kira was an infant and stayed in the rocking chair long after the cradle was put away. On especially cold nights, the blue star quilt was still pulled over knees in the den while the television murmured and tea steamed on coasters. The seasonal airing felt like a respectful pause rather than nostalgia. One bright October morning, Kira arrived just as Imogen was shaking out the blue star quilt over the porch rail. The cotton lifted once and settled into the sunlight. David came through with a basket of laundry and set it down to help. The three of them moved with the ease of people who knew where to stand in relation to a wide piece of cloth. Kira held one corner. David lifted another. Imogen smoothed the middle with both palms and checked the repaired seam by habit. Kira asked why the quilts needed sun when the dryer warmed things perfectly well. Imogen smiled because the question belonged to a newer world and a reasonable one. She answered it inwardly before she spoke it aloud. The quilts needed more than heat. They needed opening. They needed a season's breath through them. A dryer could tumble warmth into cloth. It could not give the fabric that brief conversation with open air and low light that made the whole house smell, ready for winter. She also kept the airing practice because it gave the change of season a visible form. Many seasonal shifts arrive gradually and go half-noticed. The first dark afternoon, the radiator beginning its little knocks. gloves moved from shelf to hook. Carrying the quilts outside and bringing them back in made autumn legible. It placed the household in conscious relation to weather rather than letting weather simply happen around it. By lunch, the quilts had been turned once and then folded over Imogen's arms in soft, weighty stacks. David carried the cedar chest lid while Kira tucked fresh sachets into the corners. The room felt different once the quilts were returned. Prepared. As if the house had accepted that colder nights were no longer hypothetical. Imogen liked that feeling. A season met with readiness has a gentler edge. That night, after the porch had gone dark and the cedar chest was closed again, Imogen thought about the way the quilts waited between uses. Many things people keep are heavy with memory. These were that, certainly, but they also remained because they still answered the cold. A quilt can be beloved and practical at the same time. What is kept longest is usually what has proven both warm to the body and steady to the life around it. Before bed, David carried the repaired quilt to the den chair because the forecast promised a chill by morning. Imogen watched him do it and recognized in the gesture the quiet success of continuation. A practice does not endure because it is explained well. It endures because someone reaches for the folded quilt when the air turns and knows exactly where it belongs. Every Thursday, after breakfast, dishes were dried and the newspaper folded, Roland drove the longer route to the market, even though the quicker road would have saved 10 minutes and 2 traffic lights. The longer route passed the old library steps, a narrow park with 3 benches under linden trees, the bakery that had changed owners twice, and the corner where his daughter once waited for the school bus with a saxophone case almost larger than she was. Roland no longer needed any of these landmarks to find the market. He kept the route because it had become one of the ways his life traveled through its own remembered shape. He was 76 and lived with his wife, Margot, in a modest apartment above a row of shops. Margot often came along if the weather was clear and sat in the passenger seat with a canvas bag on her knees and a list folded into fourths inside her coat pocket. Their friend Elsie met them for lunch twice a month and always asked whether Roland had taken the scenic road, as if the answer explained something about the quality of the day. In a way, it did. The route had started as practicality. Years earlier, it avoided a bottleneck near the bridge and let Roland stop for dry cleaning or pick up a prescription without doubling back. Then the city changed, traffic changed, and the practical reason faded. The route remained. It gathered layers. Here was the florist where Margot bought tulips one bleak March and brought the apartment back to life. Here was the curb where Roland and his daughter loaded poster board for a school project that consumed an entire Saturday and then somehow became one of the family's most pleasant, remembered days. Here was the diner where his father once insisted on pie before noon because the pie had just been set in the case and waiting would have been foolish. On a windy morning, Margot came along with the list and a tin for Elsie. Roland took the usual long turn without comment. Margot noticed, as she always did, the slight settling that came over him once the familiar sequence began. The city outside the windows did not become the past. It remained entirely present. Still, certain corners carried earlier versions of the same lives within them. A person can move through a neighborhood and feel several decades coexist in the same block. Margot asked once, years earlier, why he did not simply admit that he liked the route. Roland had laughed because liking it was true and insufficient. He kept the route because it turned errands into continuity. A market trip could remain only a market trip, efficient and forgettable. Or it could pass the library where he once returned books with a sleepy child on one shoulder, the crosswalk where Margot waved from a bus window during the period when they shared one car and more patience than money, the bench where he sat alone for 15 minutes after a difficult week and discovered that looking at pigeons was not a solution but was somehow still useful. That Thursday, they paused at the bakery for a loaf and then continued on. Roland parked farther from the market than necessary because he preferred approaching from the side entrance with its bins of oranges and potted herbs. Margot never objected. She had come to understand that the route belonged to the quiet architecture of his week. Some habits are not about resistance to change. They are about keeping one dependable corridor open between present action and stored life. Later, after lunch with Elsie and the carrying upstairs of produce, Roland put the car keys in the bowl by the door and felt the mild satisfaction the route always left behind. Nothing dramatic had occurred. Lettuce bought, soup bones found, bread still warm. Yet the morning had included a passing acknowledgement of how much of a life remains embedded in ordinary geography. Streets remember through repetition what people would otherwise have to summon by force. That evening, while Margot sliced pears and Roland rinsed grapes at the sink, he thought of other things people keep besides objects. They keep timings, routes, and ways of turning toward familiar corners. They keep the impulse to look at a certain tree each October, or to park by the side entrance because that is where years of arrivals have taught the body to expect the door. Memory is not always stored in drawers and boxes. Sometimes it lives in motion. Before bed, Roland folded the market list and tucked it under the magnet on the refrigerator for next week's notes. He knew the efficient road would still exist on Thursday if rain or urgency required it. But unless there was reason to hurry, he would take the longer way again. It did not feel indulgent. It felt proportionate. A later life benefits from a few chosen stretches of unoptimized time. The kept route asked for only a little more fuel and returned a larger sense of belonging than the shortcut ever had. When Sabra and Neil began packing for the move to a smaller apartment, the first box Sabra labeled in thick black marker was not kitchen or books or bedroom. She wrote, "Keep near." The box was medium-sized, old and sturdy. Into it, she placed the kettle, the good scissors, the blue cardigan she reached for in all uncertain temperatures, a packet of tea, the little brass clock for the mantel, and a framed snappy shot of Neil laughing at a picnic table. Neil watched without comment and understood at once that she was not choosing valuables. She was choosing continuity. Sabra was 78. Neil was 80. They were leaving the rambling house where they had spent 36 years because the stairs had become less charming and more repetitive than either of them cared to admit. Their daughter Maris came every Saturday with packing tape and practical patience. Their grandson Luca carried boxes to the car and liked reading the labels aloud as if inventory itself were a form of narrative. Many shelves and drawers yielded things Sabra could release without strain. Duplicate serving spoons. Decorative bowls received as gifts and never truly absorbed into the life of the kitchen. A lamp too tall for any room they actually sat in. Scarves once loved and then not reached for again. She felt clear. Age had not made every object more precious. It had made the right few more visible. The keep near box stayed open in the dining room while other cartons filled and closed. Neil added his old fountain pen, the jar opener that fit his grip better than any newer model, and the folded map of their old county roads, even though they no longer needed it for navigation. Maris came in with newsprint and found herself smiling at the contents. The box looked almost humble compared with the framed prints and heavier furniture still waiting for judgment. Yet she recognized something important in her parents' selections. A later life is rarely anchored by the grandest possessions. More often, it rests on the things that allow a day to begin feeling like itself at once. One afternoon, Luca asked why the box contained such ordinary items when far more expensive things remained wrapped in blankets against the wall. Sabra sat on the floor beside the open carton and considered the question. She kept these because they were first-day objects, The kettle makes morning possible before the cupboards are organized. The scissors open what still needs opening. The cardigan steadies a cool room while curtains are being hung. The clock gives the new mantle a pulse. The photograph reminds the eye, in the middle of upheaval, that delight has already lived in the family and can live there again. She also kept them because much else had earned the right to fade naturally. She found that many possessions quietly released themselves once their season was over. They did not need dramatic decisions. They simply no longer followed her inwardly into the next place. What remained attached was smaller, plainer, and more exact. By moving weak, the Keep Near box rode in Neil's car rather than the truck. Maris carried it into the new apartment before the dishes, before the bedding, before the stack of flattened cartons by the recycling room. Luca set the brass clock on the mantel while Sabra plugged in the kettle and Neil found the tea. Within half an hour, one corner held a clock, a cardigan draped over a chair, and steam beginning to cloud the kitchen window. The place had begun. That first evening, while Maris folded paper around glasses and Luca argued gently with a stubborn bookshelf bracket, Sabra opened the Keep Near box again and noticed how little it contained compared with what had been left behind. She did not feel deprived. She felt relieved by the scale of what truly mattered in transition. A whole life had not been reduced to a carton. It had simply revealed the handful of objects that knew how to cross a threshold quickly and make the new rooms legible. Later, after the movers were gone and the old house keys sat on the new brass tray by the door, Sabra looked around and understood that keeping is not the same as clinging. Some things are held because they still perform an essential kindness. They warm, open, mark time, or remind. Other things fade with no betrayal involved. They served, and then they loosened their hold. That loosening can be part of wisdom too. Before bed, Neil reached for the blue cardigan from the chair where Sabra had left it and folded it over the foot of the bed in the new room. The gesture was so ordinary that it settled her immediately. What people keep, in the end, often turns out to be whatever can enter an unfamiliar room and begin making it feel inhabited before the boxes are even cut open. In the top drawer beside the stove, Leland kept only 7 things. A wooden spoon darkened at the bowl. Kitchen scissors with one red handle faded nearly pink. A stub of candle for power flickers. A box of matches. A church key for old tins. No one bought much anymore. But not never. A small pad of paper for writing down what had run out before the thought disappeared. And a smooth, flat stone. His granddaughter Opal once painted yellow and then forgot on the windowsill until it became part of the house. People opening the drawer expected clutter and found arrangement instead. Leland was 79 and lived with his husband Mercer in an apartment where the kitchen was narrow enough that 2 people learned each other's timing or suffered for it. Their daughter Wren came every Friday with groceries and stories from her office. Opal, now 16, still checked that the yellow stone remained in the drawer each time she visited. The top drawer had become one of those family locations whose contents were known almost by body memory. A hand reached before the mind named the item. There had not always been so little in it. Years earlier, the drawer held rubber bands, spare batteries, menus, pens that barely wrote, twist ties, mystery keys, and 3 kinds of tape. One January, while snow made the windows look whiter than the walls, Leland emptied the drawer onto the table and discovered that disorder had a way of presenting itself as preparedness. Keeping everything near was not the same as keeping the right things near. He put back only what was regularly reached for and let the rest find truer homes or leave entirely. Mercer had been skeptical at first because household drawers developed their own politics. Remove one object and another seemed suddenly orphaned. The spoon was always there for soup. The scissors were always there for parsley or string or the corner of a stubborn packet. The stone stayed for no practical reason except that Opal had painted it, but even that gave the drawer a kind of domestic signature, a reminder that not all usefulness is functional. One Friday, Wren arrived early and found Leland wiping the drawer clean before returning each item to its place. A little flower had gathered in the back corner. Mercer was slicing apples. Opal stood at the counter, pretending not to be interested, and then coming over each time something was set back down. The ritual took only a few minutes, yet everyone in the room paid attention, as though the drawer were being assembled rather than tidied. Opal asked why Leland never added anything new when newer kitchens seemed to multiply. Gadgets without effort. He held the yellow stone for a moment before setting it back beside the pad of paper. He kept the drawer spare because the important things reveal themselves better against quiet. A crowded drawer is harder to trust. So, sometimes, is a crowded life. The objects one reaches for, repeatedly, tell the truth more clearly than the objects one stores out of vague possibility. He also kept the yellow stone because every useful system benefits from one item that does nothing except connect the room to affection. The spoon stirred. The scissors cut. The candle waited. The stone simply stayed. Yet when Opal opened the drawer, there was her own younger hand, still bright under the worn paint. Families often keep one small, unnecessary thing among the necessary ones. Not to justify it, only to prevent usefulness from becoming impersonal. After supper, Wren wrote next week's grocery reminders on the small pad, while Mercer snipped dill with the red-handled scissors. Opal rolled the yellow stone under her palm and put it back exactly where it belonged. Leland watched these motions with quiet satisfaction. The drawer was not important in any grand sense. Still, it demonstrated something he had come to trust. What remains close over time is rarely random. Repetition edits the household. Need refines nearness. Memory gives one or two items special passage past practical tests. By evening, the dishes had been done and the apartment had taken on its gentler lights. Leland slid the drawer shut after returning the spoon and scissors. He understood then that many things fade naturally, not because they were mistakes, but because they never became part of the hand's true circuit. They stayed in the drawer and were never chosen. What survives constant choosing becomes the real inventory of a life. Not everything owned, only what keeps entering the day and proving it belongs there. Before bed, Opal opened the drawer one more time and touched the yellow stone as if checking a small promise. Leland saw this and said nothing. He preferred the silence around such habits. The kept things in a home do not always announce their reasons. Sometimes a wooden spoon and a painted stone tell the whole story quietly enough between them. By night, most houses reveal what they have truly kept. The larger efforts fall quiet first. Dishes are dried, doors checked, curtains drawn. In that soft hour, what remains visible is rarely the grand possession or the expensive improvement. More often it is the lamp left glowing in one room a little longer than needed. The cardigan folded over a chair in case the air cools before dawn. The pencil returned to its place beside a list that can wait until morning but should not be forgotten entirely. The kettle set ready, the drawer closed with only the familiar few things inside. Over many years, life sheds more than it keeps. Styles pass through rooms and then out of them. Interests flare and soften. Projects imagined in one decade do not always follow into the next. Entire bags of objects leave a house with less sorrow than once seemed possible. What remains attached does so, with surprising calm. A tin of buttons, a chair by the back door, a stack of napkins tied with ribbon, a map still folded along the old lines, a thermos on its hook, a blanket aired and returned before weather turns. The kept thing is seldom arbitrary. It stays because it has entered the rhythm of care. A person still folds the towels in the same order, still winds the clock before evening tea, still takes the longer road because the corners along it know the family's history, still lays out a quilt before the first hard chill, still ties a parcel with string instead of tape because the knot can be undone without damage, still leaves a note where another hand will find it by morning. Habit outlives urgency. Yet certain motions continue because they have become less like tasks and more like forms of recognition. They tell the day what kind of house it is entering. Memories do not remain in equal measure either. That may be one of the quieter mercies of time. The mind does not preserve every afternoon with the same force. Much of life is allowed to blur. Minor aggravations lose their names. Small embarrassments loosen and fall away. What stays clear tends to be oddly selective and deeply ordinary. The sound of a metal latch on a beloved toolbox, a hallway coat under weak winter light, the smell of sharpened cedar from a pencil, a porch rail lined with quilts, a spoon in the top drawer exactly where the hand expects it. Perhaps that is because a life is built less from major declarations than from repeated contact with humble things. A room becomes familiar through the objects that keep answering the hand correctly. A family becomes itself through gestures repeated so often that nobody thinks to describe them anymore. Hold this corner. Set that there. Save the good box. Leave the lamp on. Bring the quilt in before damp rises. Such practices are almost invisible while they are being lived. Only later do they show their full shape. They were the weave of it. There is also a gentleness in how much is permitted to fade. Not every saved object must be carried forward. Not every old plan deserves storage. Many things do their work and then grow lighter in the mind until letting them go feels less like loss than like correct proportion. The house grows clearer. Time edits without cruelty when it is allowed to. It reveals that keeping is not the same as clutching. Keeping, at its best, is a form of quiet discernment. This still serves. This still steadies. This still knows the shape of the day. So the later years often gather themselves around a smaller, truer inventory. Not an inventory made for impressing strangers. Not one arranged by price or rarity. The things that warm, mend, measure, mark, sharpen, tie, hold, or wait. The habits that begin an evening, prepare a meal, remember a birthday, air a quilt, or make a new room feel inhabited before the boxes are all opened. The memories that return without effort and ask for nothing except brief acknowledgement. Together they form a kind of low, steady wisdom. They suggest that a life may be known less by everything it accumulates than by what still remains meaningful after much else has drifted off. In one house, a clock ticks on the mantel while the kitchen cools. In another, a folded route waits with the car keys by the bowl near the door. In another, a notebook in a drawer remembers the width of a window and the color of a wall no one wants to guess at again. In another, a painted stone rests beside a wooden spoon. In another, a blue coat hangs in the closet. Not needed tomorrow and still not ready to leave. The lights go out gradually. A final drawer slides shut. A chair is set back in its patch of shadow. Fabric settles. Wood holds the day's last warmth for a little while. The houses grow still around their kept things, and in that stillness, nothing needs explaining. The useful remains useful. The loved remains near. The rest is allowed to fade.